CD 4. Sandra was growing bigger by the day. He was a little scared of becoming responsible for a son or daughter of his own. Excited, yes. Hadn't he always wanted children with Elsie? Sandra, however, was not Elsie. She was already talking about a full-time nanny. How he was going to afford everything was pretty daunting. He had written to Elsie, care of the Waterways address she had left him, to tell her, as yet, there'd been no offer made on the house, and that he'd thought it might sell more quickly with someone in residence. He hadn't had a reply. Of course, his partner at the office and the rest of the staff knew he'd taken Sandra as his common-law wife. He was aware they had lost respect for him. So far, it hadn't affected the firm. He hoped to be divorced and remarried quickly and quietly. Elsie hadn't needed to take on her undesirable job at Priddy's to help the war effort, but she had gone where she was needed, which had brought her a degree of prestige in the town. Naturally, this displeased Sandra. Geoffrey was quite proud of how Elsie had done her duty by the country, dealt with the marriage breakdown and settled to working on the narrow boats. He knew it was hard, dirty work. He glanced at the bedside clock and sighed. It was time to get up. Soon the taxi would arrive, spilling out Sandra, her treasures to clutter his house, and her many suitcases. Today, too, was the day on which his nemesis, Fluffy, would move in. "What do you want out of this life?" Tolly was manning Mallard's controls, Elsie beside her. Dorothy had changed boats, saying she wanted to make sure Izzy was feeling strong enough to cope with the day in Oxford, after reading about Charlie. There was no certainty the girls would stay together on their first foray into freedom from the cut. Fields and weeping willows had given way to stone warehouses lining the canal. "At this moment I want a bath," said Elsie. "And, as I've never felt so tired in all my life as I do now, a proper bed wouldn't go amiss. Long term, I'd give anything for a home and children. That's all I've ever wanted. Children are out of the equation, so I'll settle for completing this job and seeing what the end of the war brings." "Doesn't seem too much to ask, does it?" Tolly replied. They were looking for a place to tie up both boats overnight. Dorothy had specified the centre of Oxford as being suitable, if there weren't too many workboats already lining the towpath. Failing that, they would have to moor up outside and walk into the city. "I'd like to own the cafe," Tolly said, "but that takes money." A dreamy look crossed her face. "I'd also like, just for once, to have a man tell me he loves me." Elsie felt tears rise. This lovely girl was like Izzy. Neither could see they had qualities that made them wonderful individuals. Izzy, because she'd been cowed by Charlie, and Tolly, because she believed her weight was a barrier to happiness. "Men aren't the answer to everything," she said. "If you don't mind me saying so, that's because you don't seem to have any trouble attracting them," Tolly replied. "I'm going to ignore that, because I saw the way you acted, talking to that Sonny Smith yesterday." Tolly looked horrified. "Was it that obvious?" "Well—" Elsie didn't continue. She stared at Tolly. Was it her imagination? She stared harder. Slowly it dawned on her. Tolly's plump face seemed more slender. She was being ridiculous, Elsie thought. It just wasn't possible that in such a short time anyone could lose weight. It certainly wasn't impossible that all the hard work was having a toning effect on their bodies. She herself felt more alive. Yes, she was tired, but her muscles didn't argue with her so much when she needed to give that extra turn with the windlass or push harder against the balance beam. And Dorothy had been sending Tolly ahead on foot to the next lock to prepare it for entry. Perhaps the exercise and wholesome food were having a beneficial effect on them all. "Look up there! Think we can squeeze in?" Heeding Tolly's words, Elsie saw a large gap in the line of narrowboats. "It'll mean tying the butty alongside, but there'll be enough room for other boats to pass." Tolly waved to Dorothy and Izzy in bunting and signalled she was attempting to slip into the empty space. Dorothy waved back, then gave her a thumbs up. Manoeuvring the long craft wasn't easy, but Tolly managed to line it up perfectly against the towpath. Elsie jumped off and began tying up to rings set in the concrete. It wasn't long before Bunting was alongside and Izzy was tying the two narrow boats together. "Well done," said Dorothy. "You get a lot more professional by the day. Now, are you all decided on how you'll spend your time here?" "I'm looking for a phone box to ring up my sister," answered Tolly. "Then I'll follow you to the public baths." "A bath is going to be my priority as well," said Elsie. She had already packed her holdall with her toiletries and the cleanest clothes she had. "Can I tag along with you, Tolly?" Izzy asked. "Of course you can." "I'll expect you all back on the boats by 8 in the morning," said Dorothy. "Unless, like me, you're planning to sleep aboard anyway." She smiled at her crew. "Don't be late back. I've planned our stops to practically the last minute, and we need to be in Limehouse on time to pick up our cargo. I suppose you've noticed the strange looks we've had from some of the boaters because we're not carrying a heavy load of some sort." Elsie nodded. "It'll seem strange when we do the pick-up," she said. "It'll slow our speed down." "If you can call a maximum of 4 miles an hour speedy," Izzy laughed. Elsie was itching to be away. Dorothy had given her directions to the spired city and its various landmarks. She needed to get away from the girls to think. She wasn't used to living in such close proximity to 3 other women. No doubt each of them felt the same, Elsie thought. Vanity was the least of her worries, but she did want to feel clean again and bring the shine back to her hair with a good wash. "I'll be going then," Elsie said. Her first stop would be at the main post office to ask if any letters were waiting for her. She had enough money for her immediate needs and felt distinctly light-headed at being in Oxford. "Have a lovely time, everyone," she called. Then she was walking down the towpath and eagerly looking for the stone steps that would take her up to the road and whatever adventure was next. Despite the early hour, the cobbled street was alive with people going about their business. Elsie took a deep breath. It was good to be on her own. She moved out of the way so a man could pass her at the side of the stone bridge. The girls, she thought, had become good friends, and she enjoyed their company. But, "Hello, Elsie. I promise I haven't followed you. I've a legitimate reason for being in Oxford." The man paused. "But I'm not going to deny that I've walked alongside this part of the cut hoping to see you." His voice tailed off. Elsie stared at the tall man wearing the raincoat and trilby. He adjusted his spectacles. "I was scared I might not see you again, and, to be honest, I couldn't bear that." Chapter 16. And there it was again. The tingle that started at the base of Elsie's spine and continued through her body, infusing her with heat and light as she looked into Jack Lumley's sea-blue eyes. For a moment, she seemed suspended in time. But gradually the sounds of traffic and the smell of the canal below came back to her. "Jack! What are you doing here?" She took in the worry etched on his face. "My usual hospital appointment with a specialist. I'm aware this is the first stop for you narrowboat women. I couldn't bear the thought that I'd never see you again, Elsie, if you decided to leave the canal here and go home." Elsie moved to one side to avoid being jostled by a stout woman pushing a perambulator that was overflowing with children. Jack carried on. "If you tell me to go, I will. I'll promise not to bother you again." He tentatively put his hand on her arm. She thought she might look like a scarecrow in her mud-spattered clothing, her hair awry and her face unwashed. How could Jack possibly want her? Elsie was also aware that she didn't want him to go away. No, not at all. "Look, we can't talk here," he continued. "Let's have a cup of tea somewhere, please. I promise I'm not a lunatic or a mad axeman. But But something wonderful happened between us, and I know you can feel it too." She nodded. She thought her voice might betray her if she opened her mouth to speak, so she allowed him to grip her hand, and they began to walk across the bridge and into the town. After a while, she broke the silence. "I need to go to the post office, and I must have a bath." Her words sounded odd even to her. "I don't mean I need a bath in the post office." She tailed off. If she didn't stop saying whatever came into her head, Jack would think she was half-witted. He laughed. "You mean you need to collect any letters and you need to wash after your stint on the boat." Elsie nodded. He was walking quickly and had transferred her holdall to his other hand. She was being propelled along a busy street when he suddenly stopped outside a large building. "Post office," he said. "I'll wait outside." As though on automatic pilot, Elsie moved along with 2 other customers towards the counter. After waiting in the short queue, she explained what she wanted and was surprised when the woman behind the grill returned with a white envelope and requested Elsie's signature. At the door, Jack waited. When she returned to his side, he merely asked, "Tea?" Elsie felt his arm link hers. Far from feeling unnatural, it felt right, even though she didn't feel comfortable walking alongside this handsome man in the sorry state she was in. Where could he take her looking as she did? As though reading her mind, Jack said, "We're going to the Randolph in Beaumont Street. I'll order tea." There seemed no need for her to argue with his plans. Elsie tucked the letter into her holdall that he still carried and allowed herself to be led down the busy Corn Market and past the Martyrs' Memorial to the hotel. They went into the foyer through the heavy glass doors of the Gothic-looking building, then towards some low tables set about with comfortable chairs. Immediately they were approached by a waiter, who seemed unfazed by her scruffiness. "Bring tea, please," Jack said. He took off his raincoat and hat, laying them on a leather chair. Then he leaned over and put both his hands on her shoulders, scanning Elsie's face with his clear, bright eyes, made larger by the dark-rimmed spectacles. Elsie could feel the intensity of his gaze. "I've only gone and fallen in love with you, Elsie." Elsie put her finger over his lips to stem more words. There was a pause while she searched his face, but all she saw were unanswered questions. Taking her fingers in his hands, he kissed them. "I've never done this before," he said. "Spontaneous passion." "What if I want it too?" Elsie sounded surer than she felt. She leaned forward and kissed him. Tentatively at first, short, tender, warm kisses, the last one lingering. Her heart was leaping with pure joy. Geoffrey had been her first and only lover. Eventually she sat back on the chair. Jack leaned forward and traced the outline of her lips with his fingers. She shivered with excitement. Was this how it had happened with Geoffrey and Sandra? A sudden awakening of what passion could be like? If so, how could she blame them for following their hearts? Her thoughts disintegrated as the waiter reappeared with a tray that he set on the table in front of them. Jack thanked him, and he left with a substantial tip. Suddenly, life was back to normal, the magic of his words overtaken by everyday happenings. Elsie put out her hand to pick up the teapot. Her fingers stilled on the white china handle. Blackened fingernails, a relic of her work on the cut, reminded her again of how she must appear to other people. "I can't be in here," she said. "Look at the state of me." "You've every right to be wherever you want. And we can solve that small problem of a bath quite quickly," Jack assured her. "Though why you are worrying about what you look like, when to me, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever met, and who's doing a job that many women wouldn't even attempt." "I need to wash," Elsie insisted, furtively looking about her. "And so you shall. Drink your tea," he commanded, finishing the job she'd started of pouring the tea into the fine china cups. "I'm in love with you. I've never felt like this about anyone in my whole life, and I know you feel the same." I sense you're unhappy, and I'm sure I can change that." Elsie, her thoughts whirling, picked up her cup, which was nothing like the tin mugs on the boats. She thought of how far away from civilization she'd been, yet just steps from busy villages and towns. A thought struck her. She was also far removed from the Elsie who'd left her home in Gosport, wasn't she? Could she go upstairs to a hotel room with a man who, a week ago, she hadn't known? It wouldn't stop at using his bathroom. How could it? She raised her eyes and stared across the table at Jack. He pushed his blonde hair off his forehead, and it immediately tumbled back. Elsie watched him read emotions on her face that she was unable to conceal. She'd been told Jack had lost his foot when his plane went down. How was she to deal with this knowledge? Her tension was now of a different sort. How would he be feeling? How should she react? Did it matter to her? Of course not. She wasn't perfect either. She came with the baggage of a husband. Again, as if reading her thoughts, Jack said, "There's one thing I have to mention. I had an accident, a plane accident. I was unable to carry on in the RAF." Elsie put her fingers across his mouth to stop him. "I know," she said. She put her cup back on the saucer. Her eye fell on her wedding ring. Could she really live for today when she was a married woman? But she wasn't a wife now, was she? Her husband had chosen a different woman, and Elsie was redundant. She was a narrowboat woman who had fallen inexplicably in love with a lockkeeper who was professing his love for her. There was a war on, and who knew what tomorrow might bring? Elsie stood up. "What are we waiting for?" she asked, putting out her hand for him to take. Together, they walked up the carpeted stairs and along a well-furnished corridor. He stopped and opened the door to his room. Elsie gasped. She'd been incarcerated on the narrowboat for only a short time, but she'd grown accustomed to the shabbiness of the surroundings. Now she gave a squeal of surprise at the long velvet curtains outlining the windows, the bed with its opulent quilt, the highly polished furniture, the scent of lavender. Jack laughed. "The bathroom is there," he said, waving towards a white door. Elsie pushed it open, and immediately felt anticipation rise as she saw the enormous white clawfoot bath. She thought of the primitive washing facilities she'd endured on the narrowboat. She couldn't help the murmur of excitement that rose in her throat as she spotted bath salts, an unopened bar of Lux soap, and, hanging from the rail, white, fluffy towels that she longed to press her face against. Even the wartime rule of 5 inches of water wouldn't destroy her pleasure in that scented, hot, luxurious bath. "Take your time," Jack said, still smiling. "I'll be out here if you need anything." She came out later swathed in a large white bath sheet. She had towelled her hair almost dry and wrapped a small towel, turban-like, around her head. She felt an incredible lightness that she knew wasn't only because the grime had gone. Jack was sitting in an armchair, listening to the wireless. There was a discussion on the attempt on Hitler's life and how the perpetrators had been suspended to hang from meat hooks on piano wire. The executions had been carried out less than 2 hours after sentencing in the People's Court. As Elsie approached, Jack switched off the wireless and stood up. "You look breathtaking," he said. His fingers fumbled at the towel until it fell from her head to the floor, and her damp hair bounced in a sweet-smelling halo around her face. Jack led her to the bed, which to Elsie seemed enormous after the cramped bunk on the narrowboat. With his hands on her shoulders, he pushed her down onto the silky softness. She watched as Jack began to remove his clothes. First, his shirt, revealing his strong, tanned upper body, his broad shoulders. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her lying, waiting. "I lost a foot during a bomb drop. Here at the hospital, they like to check up on me. It doesn't bother me now, but I'll understand if you feel you can't cope with the sight of—" "Shut up," she said. She moved across the bed, her bath sheet falling away, and put her hands on his shoulders, turning him towards her, kissing his skin and loving the slightly musky, salty taste. Then he was naked and hungry for her. They lay together, content yet exhausted. Eventually Elsie murmured, "So that's what it's all about." "You didn't know?" "I never knew," she answered through his kisses. Elsie wondered at the miracle of it all. She pulled her head away and looked at him. All she saw in his blue eyes was his love for her, totally unguarded. Elsie grinned at him. Looping her legs around him, she pulled him closer, wondering why such love-making had been denied her until now. They had spent the day discovering each other. A knock at the door woke her. She stretched and pulled the crumpled sheet higher to cover herself. "Good evening, my little ray of sunshine," Jack said, wheeling over the trolley he'd accepted from the waiter at the door. Elsie sat up. "What have you there?" she asked, now fully awake. She could smell gravy, and her stomach rumbled. "Dinner? I telephoned down for food." Jack looked contrite. "Though, if you'd rather we went out, or down to the restaurant, it's fine by me." "No. I want to stay in this room forever," she said, noticing that to answer the door, he'd pulled on a long dressing gown. "And I want you to tell me more about yourself," he said, pushing the trolley close to the bed and climbing in beside her. He looked into her eyes. "If we're to spend the rest of our lives together, there must be absolute truth between us. Do you agree?" "Is that what you want?" Elsie asked. "Truth and forever?" "I don't make a habit of following women." "Something happened between us on the loch near my cottage. Call it love at first sight. Call it a bolt of lightning. Call it whatever you want." He lifted a silver dome from a dish of pork chops, and the meaty scent wafted tantalizingly towards her. "Even when there's a war on, the Randolph can conjure up wonderful food. 1 or 2? He asked. "Can I have 2 chops?" "Elsie, you can have whatever is in my power to give you." "I love you." Chapter 17. The girls were draped over the stern of Mallard eating Tolly's dinner offering of corned beef hash and discussing their time in Oxford. "It's such a beautiful place," said Elsie. "From what you've been saying, Elsie, it's a wonder you noticed anything except Jack," laughed Tolly. "I wish I had a handsome admirer to run after me." Elsie knew the girls had witnessed her departure with him. She couldn't help blushing. Izzy jumped in. "After what she's been through, she needs a bit of happiness in her life. But I agree, Oxford is beautiful." Elsie mentally thanked her for ending their incessant teasing. "Do you know why it hasn't been bombed?" The girls turned towards Dorothy's voice. "I read somewhere that Hitler thinks he'll make Oxford his home when he invades us." For a moment there was silence, apart from the sounds on the cut around them, as they digested Dorothy's words. "We'd better hurry up and win this war, then," said Elsie. "You suspect Jack will be waiting?" Tolly was like a dog with a bone. "No one was more surprised than me. It was fate and a hospital appointment that brought us together again. Though Jack knew narrowboats usually tie up in that spot, because it's easier to get to the public baths from there. He got a friend to mind the lock and to look after his little dog. I've always wanted a pet." For a moment she looked as if she was reliving a wonderful dream. Then she added, "My husband said dog hair gave him asthma." Tolly frowned. "Jack probably knows we'll be taking Duke's Cut to knock the mileage off our trip to Limehouse," said Dorothy. "It's full steam ahead now to pick up our loads. Our next proper stop will be Henley-on-Thames, and it's quite a distance, so I don't want any moans about locks or swing bridges." "What did you do with your time off?" Elsie asked Dorothy, glad again that the subject of her and Jack had been deflected. "Paperwork, shopping and enjoying the peace and quiet away from you lot," Dorothy laughed. "Until Tolly and I came back to spend the night on the boat," broke in Izzy. "Then we all went up the pub." "Good, was it?" asked Elsie. "We played darts until Sonny Smith came in and insisted on joining in." Elsie saw Tolly colour. "He said it could be 2 against 2 if he played." Izzy was scraping her plate. "And I was amazed at how quickly he could total the scores on the blackboard. I've been using my fingers." "He was only being friendly," Tolly put in. Elsie could see she was embarrassed. "You like him, don't you?" Izzy said. "He reminds me of Charlie." Elsie frowned at her. "Did you give that book back to the old man?" she asked, to diffuse the argument she could sense was about to start between the two younger women. "No, he wasn't in the pub," said Tolly, "and it was too far for any of us to run back to Bunting to get it. Sonny said the book belonged to his grandmother, Sarah. Apparently, she had red hair just like Izzy's. It runs in their family. He said his granddad was hoping Izzy would find time to read to him again." "He's a very charming man, that Sonny," said Dorothy, raising an eyebrow to show she was teasing them. "He bought us all a drink." "He's too good to be true," said Izzy. "Beware of boatmen bearing gifts." "Don't be nasty," Tolly said. "Does that mean if you get the chance you won't read his grandfather any more of The Man in the Iron Mask?" Izzy relented. "We've already been told not to expect any time off until we reach Henley, so I'll think about it." "Perhaps Sonny'll read to him," Elsie said. She began collecting the plates and cutlery and stood up to take them into the cabin to wash up. "Did Jack tell you why he was discharged from the RAF?" Dorothy asked Elsie as she followed her to make tea. Elsie thought how warm it was inside the cabin. While they'd been sitting out in the night, it had grown colder. "He told me about his foot, but he didn't want to go into details," she said. "It certainly didn't put me off him. In fact, I thought how brave he is, because unless you knew, you'd certainly not suspect he had an artificial foot. He gets about so easily." She remembered how shy and hesitant he'd become when he was talking about himself. "I love him all the more for not being perfect," she added. "Do you love him, Elsie?" She noted the seriousness of Dorothy's question. She paused before she said quietly, "I do. I don't know how it's come about, but I want Jack in my life now. I'm an extremely lucky woman." "Yes," Dorothy said. She stared hard at Elsie, then went back to pouring the boiling water into the big enamel teapot, but not before Elsie had seen a glint of tears in her eyes. Elsie put the cleared dishes into the washing-up bowl. She watched as Dorothy finished filling the teapot, then poured the remaining hot water onto the plates so they could soak and be washed later. Elsie said quietly, "You know, you can talk to me, don't you?" She could hear the murmur of voices outside as Tolly and Izzy chatted. "I don't want to pry, but I've seen you rereading a letter when you think I'm not noticing." All at once Dorothy became brisk and businesslike. "What do you mean, letter?" She was gathering mugs together. Elsie felt the change in the atmosphere. Had she stepped over the mark? Dorothy was her employer and superior. It was then she remembered her own letter. She'd stuffed it into her holdall, and there it had stayed. Elsie tried to lighten the mood between her and Dorothy. "I collected a letter from the post office, but then I forgot all about it, and it's been at the bottom of my holdall ever since." She went to the cupboard beneath her bed space and pulled out the bag. "I must put these away." She remembered how Jack had laughed at her for washing her dirty clothes in the bath, instead of sending them down for housekeeping to attend to, as was his suggestion. Self-consciously, Elsie had draped all the wrung-out clothing over every available radiator in their room. Now she tipped out her clothes and grabbed the letter. She heard Dorothy's voice chatting to Tolly and Izzy as she served them tea, strong and sweet with the condensed milk. Dorothy came down the steps and into the cabin. Elsie was reading avidly. Then she sighed and looked across at Dorothy. "I'd planned on going back to Gosport for a few days, after we delivered our goods on the cart," she said. "I was looking forward to the time off you'd promised." "What's the matter?" Dorothy came and stood next to her. "Geoffrey's moving Sandra into my home," she said. She felt Dorothy's arms go around her. "He says if the place is occupied, it'll sell faster." Dorothy was nodding. "What he says is perfectly logical," she said, stepping back. "Does it really matter now you've got Jack?" Elsie sighed. "It matters to me because my heart and soul went into that house. He couldn't have afforded to buy it if I hadn't handed over my payoff after I stopped teaching." She brushed away a stray tear. "Still, I should look to the future now, not the past. Jack made me promise to let him collect me from Lower Hayford when our first trip's finished to spend my time with him at the lockkeeper's cottage," she said. "At first I refused." She looked at Dorothy's quizzical face. "I told him I was popping back to Gosport first. Then I intended to stay with him." "Forget Gosport. Let it be a new beginning for you." Elsie stared at her, her mood lightening. "Yes," she said. "It really will be, won't it? Before I turn in for the night, I'll have a word with Izzy. It'll be good for the pair of us to catch up on things." The days passed in a blur of countryside, villages, lush vegetation, mishaps with steering when mudbanks caught them unawares, and rain that drenched them, slowed them down and chilled them to the bone. Each night they were happy to crawl into their sleeping bags and tumble into their bunks, tired out, yet ready to face the next day with vigour. Each morning they set off after breakfast a little nearer to Limehouse Basin. So, too, each morning, Dorothy started the journey with a song. She had a good, clear voice that echoed through the sweet-smelling air and encouraged the girls in the butty to join in with her. The White Cliffs of Dover was her favourite, but every time she spotted a rabbit in a field, she'd break off whatever she was singing to shout, "Run, rabbit, run!" Elsie relished her new life. She stole time to write letters to Jack. She was thrilled whenever a letter waited at a postal point for her. She was opening her mind to things she'd never experienced before. She loved the horse-drawn boats with the men who stopped the horses and uncoupled them, allowing them to pass on over the top of a tunnel, then hauled the boats themselves because the tunnels were too narrow to provide passage for horses. Elsie felt guilty about overtaking these proud watermen, who had inhabited the canals for far longer than they ever would. Usually Dorothy would wave and smile, and sometimes got a wave in return. Henley came and went. Most of the time they travelled within hailing distance of the boat Aurora and its butty, Avalon, owned and worked by Sonny Smith and his grandfather. It was quite usual, Dorothy said, for narrow boats to keep at more or less the same pace on the cut, often mooring at nights within sight of each other, as they had at Oxford. Rivalry to enter locks first, so they didn't need to wait for emptying or filling, was rife among some gypsies, and many times Elsie drew back the curtain or stood on the rear of the boat to discover that a neighbouring craft had left before them, making a ridiculously early start simply to get ahead. The girls were quickly learning the ways of the boat people. Mallard and Bunting carried no cargo yet, but Aurora and Avalon hauled coal. Nevertheless, they felt proud when rounding a bend in the cut to discover the two black-painted boats only a short way ahead. Sonny seemed to have an instinct to discover the best places for mooring up, usually within walking distance of a pub, and Elsie guessed Dorothy was happy to follow in his footsteps, so the girls could have a drink and play a few games of darts, or crib with the regulars. Elsie, too, was happy with this. It was something to look forward to after a gruelling day. Washing faces, brushing hair, searching for clean, dry clothes to put on for going out. Chapter 18. Izzy sat back on the hand-embroidered cushion. The old man had closed his eyes, and she wondered if he was asleep. Sometimes he shut his eyes as he listened to her read. If she stopped turning the flimsy pages, he'd open one to let her know he was enjoying the sound of her voice and hadn't dropped off. She loved the coziness of Aurora, though she wondered how two men could possibly keep the boat so spick and span. The wooden walls were hung with pottery plates depicting hand-painted scenes of the canal system, and two colourful rag rugs lay over the bare boarding of the floor.
"Well, what happens next in the story?"
The rasp of Steve-O's voice brought her back from her reverie. Then he asked,
"Like them rugs, do you?"
"They're lovely. Where did you buy them?"
Izzy turned the book over so it lay face down beside her. She loved it when Steve-O told her snippets of his life on the cut. When Mallard and Bunting had moored up near Aurora and its butty, Izzy sometimes preferred to sit and read to the old man instead of going out with the others.
"Port, you can't buy quality like that. My Sarah made those and that cushion you're sitting on. She was a needlewoman, she was. On Jonquil, her stuff is all packed away neatly."
The effort of talking brought on a bout of coughing. Izzy knew better than to fuss around him, which only made him cross. She waited until the red handkerchief came out and he'd mopped his mouth before she asked,
"What's Jonquil?"
A smile lit his tired eyes.
"My Sarah's boat. She's moored near Braunston. Sonny looks after her, makes sure she's waterworthy. But she's a tiddly little thing, barely 40 foot. No good for work, but my Sarah ran her own business from her and lived on her. That's how we met, Sarah and me."
"Ran a business?"
Izzy couldn't help interrupting. His Sarah sounded a wise woman, with a home and business of her own on the cut.
"Sarah made rugs and cushions. She had a sewing machine, and it's still on the boat. She'd moor up at busy places and sell her wares."
His eyes closed briefly.
"It took me a good while to persuade her to marry me. Did I tell you you've hair like hers?"
Izzy nodded.
"How come the boat still survives?"
"She'd marry me," she said, "as long as she could go off on her own sometimes. She was a loner, my Sarah. She loved her books and her painting."
Again Steve-O's eyes closed. Before Izzy had time to speak, he opened them again and said,
"I knew if I wanted that woman, I'd have to toe the line."
"So she was an artist as well?"
"She was self-taught. Had a gift, you see. She painted them plates on the walls here."
He raised a bony hand and pointed towards the pottery dishes.
"It wasn't so much pictures and canvases she painted. No, she'd collect odd-shaped stones and paint birds and animals on them. What she saw on the cut. Popular, they was. Many of the women on the canals was too weighted down with children and chores. No time to do anything artistic. So my Sarah's stuff sold well."
"But you had children."
After all, she thought, Steve-O had a grandson, didn't he?
"Only the one."
Steve-O was staring at her. A look of regret passed over his face.
"Only the one,"
he repeated.
"I thought when Zelda came along, my Sarah would get more settled. Wasn't so. She'd take the little one with her, moor up, then after a month or so, come back to me, and it would be like being newly married all over again. And she'd sit and read to me."
His voice tailed off.
"Because I love the bones of her. I let her do as she wanted, so she'd be content."
He was speaking as briskly as his breathing would allow.
"So when the other blokes tried to take the mickey, because I was letting a slip of a thing run rings round me, I'd bop them on the nose to keep them in line. You see, I'd done a bit of bare-knuckle fighting in me youth.
Again his voice faltered. Izzy had already gathered his life with Sarah hadn't been easy. It was a very masculine business, working the cut. Women usually towed the line.
You must have loved her a lot,
she said.
I did, but it broke her when Zelda ran away from us, leaving fatherless Sonny behind.
It took Izzy a while to understand what the old man meant.
So, Zelda had a baby without being married.
For that to happen on the cut must have caused great distress to Steve-O and Sarah. Probably even more shaming than had it happened in Gosport, she thought. And neighbours there could be very cruel with their gossip.
We never knew who Sonny's father was, but Sonny was the best thing that happened to me. I taught him all I knows.
Steve-O smiled.
Taught him to run after girls.
Izzy laughed, trying to lighten the atmosphere. The clock ticked away while Steve-O pondered her words.
Not me. There was only one girl for me, my Sarah. He's got traces of his father in him. Must have. My Sonny knows the difference between right and wrong, and deep down he's a good man. Well, he's looked after me all these years since Sarah died. And me and him, we rub along just fine together.
Izzy looked round the spotless cabin. For one man and an elderly invalid, the place was like a little palace.
You don't like him, do you?
Steve-O's question startled her. Was it so obvious to him?
It's not about liking him. I've just left a man who in my eyes is very similar to Sonny, looks and all.
Izzy got up and opened the stove's door and pushed in a log from the stack piled next to it on the floor.
Is that so? Tell me about the bugger what's hurt you, because I can tell you've had pain, a little thing like you.
Before she could help herself, the warmth from the fire and Steve-O's friendliness helped her unburden herself. He listened carefully without interrupting. Then he said,
I don't want to upset you, but a man like that won't let you go, you know. But you mustn't judge a book by its cover. Sonny's got a heart of gold. I reckon you're like my Sarah. Just wants to be on her own, to gather her thoughts together.
Maybe,
Izzy said.
She had an unhappy childhood, my Sarah. Until I won her heart, she didn't trust people. I think that's why she liked her own company. I respected that. Sonny thought the world of her. He looks like my Sarah as well, with that lovely hair, just like yours.
His voice faltered as they heard footsteps and laughter. Then a chill breeze blew inside the cabin as the door opened. Sonny and Tolly filled the small space. Tolly, Izzy noticed, had a broad grin on her face. They had brought in with them the smells of beer and cigarettes.
What are you doing here?
Izzy asked Tolly.
Came with Sonny to walk you back to our boat,
Tolly said. Izzy could tell Tolly had had a few drinks. Her voice was far too loud. I'm making hot chocolate, said Sonny, shrugging himself out of his jacket. Want some? Yes, please, said Tolly and Steve-O together.
No, thank you,
replied Izzy, picking up the book, closing it, and setting it back on the arm of her chair.
We've an early start tomorrow.
Haven't we all? Said Sonny, his dark eyes seeking hers. Again panic took hold of Izzy. She grabbed her shapeless cardigan from the back of the chair, then turned to Steve-O.
I'll see you again soon, she said. Look after the book.
She bent and kissed his weathered cheek, then grabbed hold of Tolly.
Come on, you, she said. Time we left.
Izzy had to squeeze past Sonny, who clearly enjoyed her discomfort. Good night, girls. Don't I get a kiss? Tolly turned to him and puckered her lips. Izzy pushed her roughly towards the wooden steps and out of Sonny's grasp. With Sonny's laugh ringing in their ears, they left the boat and joined the towpath to walk to Bunting.
So you've had a good evening in the pub, then?
Izzy asked. Yes, and I'd have had some more fun if you hadn't dragged me away.
I don't mean to spoil your happiness, but Sonny's only out for what he can get.
You sure you're not just a little bit jealous? Izzy decided to let that remark pass. She was well aware Tolly had been drinking, and sometimes it was easy for a person's tongue to run away with them. Tolly, however, didn't want to let things go. I think you fancy Sonny, she said argumentatively. I think that's why you spend time with the old man, hoping to get into Sonny's good books. Izzy stopped walking and pulled Tolly round so that she was facing her.
I think you should never reckon to know what I feel. I wouldn't care if I never saw another man as long as I live. I had enough with Charlie. I enjoy being with Steve-O because there's no harm in him.
Those words came out with one breath.
I thought you were my friend, and friends don't say things like that.
Izzy swung away, but she was determined to have the final say.
But when everything blows up in your face, Tolly, I'll still be there for you.
Then Izzy swiftly walked away, leaving Tolly to ponder her words. She was in her bunk, pretending to sleep when Tolly finally returned to the boat. She guessed she'd been for a walk to think things over. She'd left the lamp turned down low. She heard the other girl clean her teeth and wash, then throw the used water overboard. Last, Tolly extinguished the oil lamp, and, as she climbed into bed, Izzy heard her say, I'm sorry, Izzy. I know I don't show it, but I'm glad I'm sharing with you. Chapter 19.
My darling, my belief is that as long as I can pour out my heart to you, I will live. I see what the Germans are doing to us, and I think, why don't you just shoot us? I've already been to the tip truck to forage for turnips. No easy task when so many other starving prisoners are doing the same thing. My wound has healed. I am one of the lucky ones. Kramer, the chief, likes to play games by taunting us men with the gift of a turnip. Then, just as an emaciated man has his hands on the precious food, it is given to another prisoner. We should be getting proper food, Jakub. Last night, Al's voice broke into my thoughts. He doesn't sound the same as he used to. I could barely hear him. This is Bergen-Belsen. Don't they know about the Geneva Convention? He was sitting on the ground in his own mess. I thought my friend would die of typhus, because so many of the disease-ridden bodies are lying dead around us. Perhaps he will die of dysentery. I hope for his sake it might be soon. At least one of us will be put out of this misery. I care a great deal about Alan Jenks. When he dies, I'll no longer hear him say, I don't know why you bothered to write letters. They probably never get to England, burned more than likely. The thing is, all the time I can hold my precious tub of pencil and beg, steal or borrow some scrap of paper on which to write to you, Dorothy. I feel close to you. You are my reason to live. This morning I had to hold Alan up while we crawled through our special morning shower. In our clothes we filed through a hut and were covered in DTT. Up our sleeves, in our faces and hair, and down our trousers. They are worried about the lice. Lice, so the guards believe, spread typhus. After we'd been sprayed, we shuffled on, stepping over dead bodies. I can't describe the smell. I know it will stay with me until it's my turn to die. Yesterday, a woman was screaming at the guard because she had no milk to feed the infant she carried. I watched as she thrust the child into his arms and, crying, shuffled away. I heard later the baby had died a week ago. Jakub.
What are you getting all dolled up for?
Tolly looked down at Izzy, who was lying on her bunk reading an old copy of Woman's Weekly. She let go the waistband of her clean green slacks. There's about 3 inches of material here that was tight on me before.
That's why I asked, Tolly. Why are you getting dressed up?
I might as well tell you. I'm going to the George to play Aunt Sally.
And I suppose Sonny's taking you?
You can come if you like.
Of course I can. It's a public house, so they're hardly likely to chuck me out. But I'm not sitting watching you go all dewy-eyed over that man.
Izzy sniffed and returned to the magazine Tolly knew she'd read several times before. She could see Izzy was tired. Today it had been lock after lock that needed unwinding. It seemed to Tolly they'd never get to their destination, no matter how hard they worked. It was only the thought of spending time in pubs at the end of the day that kept her sane. That, and seeing Aurora just ahead of them.
Anyway, what's Aunt Sally?
Izzy asked. It's a game they play up here. Sonny told me all about it. A white skittle is placed on the top of a metal plinth, and you have to knock it off with sticks. Sonny's asked me to be in his team. You have to throw underarm, and a team consists of 8 players.
Spare me the details,
Izzy interrupted.
Are the other 2 going?
I don't know, do I? Tolly had no idea whether Sonny had invited Elsie and Dorothy. She hoped not. She wanted at some point in the evening to be alone with him. Not that she'd get much chance in the pub, because, as always, he'd be the centre of attention, laughing and joking with the men and eyeing up the pretty girls.
Is Steve-O going?
Tolly was cross. Don't keep asking me questions. Why don't you get ready and come out with me when Sonny knocks on the side of the boat? If he's alone, you can go on up the towpath to Aurora and play nursemaid to the old man. Can I borrow your curling tongs?
They're in my little cupboard.
Thank you. Tolly gritted her teeth in a smile that was more a grimace. She foraged in Izzy's cupboard and, extracting the curling tongs, placed them on top of the stove, allowing only the metal part to heat up.
Come on in, love. I can tell by that timid knock it's you.
In the dusk, the vibrant paintings of castles and roses set against the black of Aurora's walls stood out brightly. Mallard and bunting paled in comparison. Izzy traced a flower with her finger before pushing open the cabin door.
I never used to be so quiet,
said Izzy, lifting the kettle to check it for water, then putting it on the stove.
Get it all knocked out of you, did you?
Izzy eyed the old man sitting in his usual place near the fire. Even when it was warm outside, she knew he felt the cold.
So you've come to that conclusion,
Izzy said. She pushed her red curls away from her eyes. She looked around for the book. Steve-O had it beside him and passed it to her.
Told you. You're like my Sarah. Took her a long while before she ever told me about the way she'd been treated as a kid. The awful things that had been done to her. That's why I never minded when she had a notion to leave me and go to Jonquil. I knew she'd come back when she felt she could face the hustle and bustle of the people on the cut. Mind you, I used to get right fed up when she took Sonny with her.
You really care about him, don't you?
Course I do. He's not just my grandson. He's the son I never had.
Above the stove there was a wooden contraption to air clothes, 2 of Sonny's shirts hanging on it. At least Izzy supposed they belonged to Sonny from the style.
I'll say one thing for him. He always looks good.
Yes, and he's never short of a pretty girl.
Izzy put a big spoonful of fresh tea leaves into the remains in the pot. She knew boaters never wasted anything, and the stronger the tea, the better they liked it. She poured in the now boiling water.
That's right. Let that settle,
said Steve-O.
Our Tolly thinks he's got a fancy for her.
Izzy had barely got the words out before Steve-O started laughing.
More fool her, I say. He's sowing his wild oats, and afterwards he'll settle for a girl that's used to living on the cut.
I told her so.
Then you must tell her again before she gets hurt. You got hurt. That's what sapped your confidence, girl.
When I worked at the munitions factory, I was full of myself.
And I bet that was a fine act you put on to cover up the way you really felt.
His words struck a chord. Had she pretended nothing was wrong, and had been chirpy and cheeky to disguise how she'd really felt about Charlie knocking her about? If that was so, now that he was no longer around, why had she become so quiet and inclined to live inside her own head?
You think so?
From how my Sarah was, I know so. You don't have to put on an act any more. You can be yourself.
Izzy busied herself pouring out the tea that resembled tar and lightened it with condensed milk.
You're a nice girl,
Steve-O said.
If I was 50 years younger,
you'd still be in love with your Sarah,
said Izzy. She settled down in the chair with the embroidered cushion and opened the book at the page she'd turned down. Before she'd had time to start reading, Steve-O asked her,
"What are you going to do when the war's over? In the pub earlier, so Sonny said, they were saying the Allied soldiers had the Germans on the run."
I don't know. Perhaps that means the end's in sight at last. I'll probably sign on for another trip, though. I can't go back to Gosport while Charlie's there. He'd find me in no time.
Thought you said the coppers got hold of him.
Izzy looked at Steve-O. He appeared tired. His hands on the arms of the chair were bones topped with blue veins.
The charges don't mean anything, she said. He's got a golden tongue, and too many people in high places owe him favours. I need to stay out of his way.
She didn't want to think about Charlie. It depressed her.
Elsie's fallen for a bloke. She can't do much about that until she's fulfilled her obligation to Dorothy and the job. But I believe she deserves a bit of happiness.
I've heard all about that. Nothing much passes me by. Tell me about Dorothy. She's a closed shop, is that one?
He scrabbled for his red handkerchief and blew his nose noisily.
Dorothy? Well, she never talks about herself, but she's offered to take me home to Southampton with her when we have leave after this trip. Maybe then I'll get to know her a bit better.
They drank their tea in companionable silence. Then Izzy read to Steve-O until she saw his head droop and his breathing told her he slept. Then she let herself out of Aurora and walked along the towpath towards the dark shape of the butty boat tied alongside Mallard. She was totally alone. Chapter 20. The empty gasometer reminded Dorothy of a spider's web, delicate, unfed, while its twin bulged fat and full. A train rattled past, smoke belching over dirty, grey back-to-back houses. There was a tang in the air, not the smell of cordite that hung over Southampton, but a dusty sharpness, like the smell of gas before it was lit. A gigantic crane rose from the landscape, like a ladder reaching towards the heavens. The green countryside had gone, replaced by factories and tall, dark, smoking chimneys. Mallard's hold was like an open mouth, waiting to devour a load, she thought. Men fastened chains around bundles of metal billets, and a smaller crane lifted the load high into the air over the dock and swung it clear of the wharf.
"Keep her steady, Joe! What do you think I'm doing? I'm only saying."
These were some of the cries that accompanied the crane driver with his cable and load, while the men guided the rusty billets. Mallard sank deeper into the water as the weight of the steel pushed her down. Dorothy had sent the three girls to buy a meal in the cafe. It had rained again before they'd reached Limehouse Basin and continued pouring for 3 days. Chains unhooked from the billets now swung dangerously close to her as she stood watching the performance. Men were talking animatedly. She stepped neatly aside as a shout warned, "Watch out!" By midday, the boats were loaded and the girls had returned, making her feel hungry as they talked about liver and onions and apple crumble. She knew she needed a break. A headache had come on. Elsie told her to go for a walk, or at least get away from the boats for a while. To leave the wharf, she had to pass through a crowd of gypsies who were excited about something she couldn't quite see. A woman's voice said, "Ain't you got something to put it in?" "What?" asked Dorothy. "Gord bless you, girl! It's sugar for free, here!" A brown carrier bag was thrust into her hands, and Dorothy allowed herself to be propelled towards the centre of the crowd. A wooden crate lay broken on the siding below a crane. From it spilled what looked to Dorothy like shiny snow, until she realised what must have happened, a malfunction of the crane. The driver was now leaning out of his contraption high in the air and grinning like a maniac. The spillage of sugar was free for anyone who cared to scoop it up. Dorothy thanked the woman profusely and fell to her knees among the scrabbling, sweaty bodies and scooped up handfuls of sweetness, thrusting it into the bag. "Not often we get something for nothing, eh?" The woman smiled at her, showing a gold tooth. "Bloody rationing's killing us." With the bag as full as she dared fill it, for fear of it bursting before she got back to Mallard, Dorothy elbowed her way out of the crush and back along the concrete wharf towards her friends. She staggered under the weight of her bounty, now clutched to her body because she dared not trust the bag's string handles. Elsie was sitting at the top of the stairs drinking tea. Immediately she saw Dorothy, she put down the mug, jumped onto the wharf and ran towards her. "What have you got?" "Sugar," gasped Dorothy. "The crane driver dropped the crate. The gypsies were scrabbling about like ants, but a woman made a space for me and gave me a bag. Just let me get it in the cabin before it spills everywhere." Down in the gloom, Tolly was reading. She eyed the excited pair with their precious cargo, jumped up from her seat and threw down her book. "I know exactly what to do with some of that," she said. At a less busy stretch of Limehouse water, Dorothy and Elsie walked along the towpath with the 2 boats' ropes and tied them at the side to begin the tiresome business of covering the loads. The sugar bounty had lifted all their spirits. Tarpaulin skins had to be stretched and lifted over the cargo. Rain falling into the holds would increase the boat's weight and make for slower travelling. Already time was of the essence. Dorothy noted that the girls, although unused to unrolling the heavy sheets, worked without dissent. Side sheets were held taut and tied down. It wasn't an easy job, but nothing on the cut so far had been easy. Eventually the boats had been made safe against the inclement weather and were ready for their journey from Limehouse along the Grand Union Canal to Birmingham. End of CD 4. CD 5. "The London locks are all double-chambered, as the traffic's greater," said Dorothy. "But don't worry. Lock-keepers are there to assist, which is a blessing, as we're used to handling empty boats. When their holds are full of iron, they take some manipulating, especially as we'll be fighting against the tidal Thames." The girls didn't seem bothered by the logistics, but were more interested in Sonny and Steve-O's whereabouts. "Aurora and her butty have disappeared," Elsie shouted. Dorothy returned, "Don't worry. He had coal and stuff to unload. I wonder what they've picked up this time and where they're going." Her eyes lit on a deeply scored bollard. Countless ropes had gouged deep lines into the metal. She thought of the ropes pulled by horses that had hauled narrowboats along the canals long before engines were installed. Iron posts, worn relics of a bygone age, remained alongside the towpaths. She remembered seeing deep grooves in the brickwork at the sides of bridges, again caused by ropes, souvenirs of days gone by. Now the load was tied down. Dorothy yelled to Tolly to put the kettle on. She was starving, not having eaten when the others visited the cafe. The thought of a thick corned beef sandwich was enticing. Dorothy was looking forward to travelling once more on the Grand Union Canal. Unique in that it was composed of at least 8 separate canals. It linked London with Nottingham, Birmingham and Leicester. Limehouse was a huge dock at the junction of the Thames, busy with craft and crowded with people. Dorothy would be happier when she was in open countryside again. She decided she wouldn't think about going back to Southampton until they dropped off their load at Birmingham. She'd asked Izzy to stay with her for a few days and felt apprehensive. But what other option was there? Clearly the girl couldn't return to Gosport. The newspaper had stated the police had Charlie in custody. But Izzy was convinced they would never make the charge stick, and he'd be out on bail or exonerated. It wouldn't be long before he discovered Izzy hadn't gone to her mother's house and clearly intended to have nothing more to do with him. She needed all the help she could get to stay hidden so Charlie wouldn't find her. No, it would be safer for Izzy to come home with her for a well-deserved break. Dorothy sighed. She had secrets of her own that she didn't want discovered, but Izzy's safety came first. Tolly would be welcomed back into her family at Titchfield, and Elsie was going to Jack. Would they all return for another trip with her? She hoped so. She congratulated herself on having chosen her crew wisely. They were friendly and hard-working. What more could she ask for? Cuppa? Tolly stood before Dorothy with a mug of strong tea in her hands. I'll be glad to get out of this place. I've never seen so much rubbish in the canals. Dorothy eyed her good-humouredly. I thought maybe you'd set your heart on catching up with Aurora. Tolly's eyes widened. You think they're ahead of us? I've no idea. Maybe we'll see them further on. Tolly's eyes brightened. Maybe, Dorothy admitted. We've got a few hours cruising left before it gets dark. Do you want to carry on? My paperwork's complete. What about the others? We all want to go. Tolly shoved a bag of biscuits at Dorothy. Dip some in your tea. Dorothy shook her head. If you make me a corned beef sandwich, we'll get out of here and not stop until we find a good place to berth for the night. Aye, aye, Captain, said Tolly. I'll pass on the message. The long wail of the air raid siren cut through the conversation. Do we look for a shelter? Tolly was plainly shaken. Dorothy realised her girls had been lulled into a false sense of security by the lack of bombing in the countryside. But this was London, and Hitler wanted to destroy the city. She made the decision. I don't fancy our chances, searching for a shelter here. Some of the workers at the basin were scattering like headless chickens, thought Dorothy. If she'd noticed any signs telling them where the shelters were, she'd have urged her girls to run for safety too. As they huddled together in Mallard's cabin, it was hard to pretend she wasn't just as scared as Elsie, Tolly and Izzy. Can you hear any planes? They all listened carefully. Perhaps it's a mistake, Izzy ventured. This is London. I wouldn't think they'd set off Moaning Minnie just for the fun of it, said Dorothy. The deafening crash that followed set Mallard rocking and heaving. Dorothy grabbed Elsie for support. What the hell was that? Tolly asked. Her eyes were big, like saucers. Everything that wasn't tied down in Mallard was moving. Cups slid along shelves, and tins banged against each other in cupboards. Tolly's frightened gaze held Elsie's. And then came the sound of crashing walls, falling masonry. Dorothy expected any moment that something would fall on their boat and rend it apart. Her fingers crossed, she prayed for their safety. The rocking and shaking seemed to go on forever. At last, the water around them began to settle. Then came the echo of ambulance bells. More movement outside. This time, running feet, people shouting. A solid thumping on the wooden cabin top startled Dorothy with its intensity. A familiar voice shouted, You lot all right in there? The girls looked at each other. It's sunny, Tolly beamed with delight. Within moments, daylight was entering the cabin as Tolly flung open the door. Sonny stood near the tiller, his white teeth glittering in a broad smile, his red curls bouncing in the breeze. He stuck his fingers into the pocket of his waistcoat, pulled out a watch, and looked at it. "It ain't official," he said, the watch back in his pocket, "but general consensus is that was one of Hitler's new weapons, the V2 rocket. More deadly than the V1s, and they don't make no sounds until they land. Somewhere close by has copped it, poor buggers." Izzy broke in,
"Is Steve-O all right?"
"Course he is. Take more than what old Adolf can chuck at us to upset him. Our Tommy's with him." He must have seen the women's confusion at the name, for he added, "We're giving him a lift back to Birmingham. Makes it easier for me with 2 loaded boats. He takes the tiller, see?" Sonny's shadow seemed to fill the cabin as he stood on the steps talking. But all Dorothy could think was how kind and neighbourly of him it had been to come over and make sure they were all unscathed. Tolly, grinning like a maniac, looked as if all her birthdays had arrived at once. Dorothy wondered who Tommy was. The way Sonny had called him "our" made her think he was a relative. "A piece of advice," said Sonny. "I wouldn't stay here tonight. There's been a dark-haired bloke, a stranger, asking after a red-haired girl. The Cup people won't let on. They don't like being questioned." He stared at Izzy. "I reckon you know who he is." Dorothy saw Izzy's face drain of colour. For a moment there was silence. Then Sonny added, "Besides, old Adolf could be sending more of them bombs."
"But I thought we were winning this war,"
Izzy said, trying to hide her fear that the man, who could only be Charlie, was looking for her. "It ain't over until it's over," Sonny said somberly. "Nothing ever is." He walked away. The Grand Union had more locks than they'd encountered so far, thought Dorothy. But at least they were out in the countryside again, and the late afternoon sun was shining through the round window onto her makeshift desk in the cabin, where she sat with her eternal paperwork. Izzy and Elsie had pulled the weighty boats over to a towpath near an orchard. Tolly had disappeared into the trees. When she returned, she was dragging a sack. She had a smile on her face a mile wide. "Come on, help me get this aboard." Eager hands reached out. "You could get shot for that," Dorothy admonished her from the top step on Mallard, but she too was grinning. The trees were heavy with ripe fruit that scented the air. Dorothy was always happier when she was surrounded by fields and cows rather than people. Ahead, before they'd moored up, she'd spotted Aurora disappearing round another bend in the cut. Now they were on their way again, she was content. Her girls were happy, especially Tolly, who'd been let off boat duties as she'd begged to cook the apples. With her hand on the tiller, Dorothy looked down at herself and smiled. They'd lived through a rocket attack, but when she went home to Southampton, she'd better smarten up a bit. She had on a pair of trousers that had long since lost the elastic around the waist, so was held up with a large safety pin. The 2 jumpers she wore kept out the cold breeze, and 2 pairs of socks warmed her feet inside her boots. She'd borrowed a woolen coat from Elsie, as her own waterproof was wet inside as well as out. Izzy was at Bunting's tiller, and Dorothy waved to her. She, too, was dressed for warmth, which was a polite way of saying Izzy looked like a scarecrow. She'd been very quiet since she'd heard someone was looking for a red-haired girl. Suddenly, there was a clunk, and a grinding noise came from beneath the boat. Dorothy swore. She guessed immediately what had happened. Something had snagged itself around the propeller. She put the engine into reverse, then swung it quickly to forward. All that happened was that a cloud of foul-smelling smoke floated upwards, then billowed around her. She turned off the engine. Chapter 21. "That's all we need," said Dorothy quietly to Elsie after she'd yelled at Izzy to pull over. Luckily, Izzy had been alert enough to steer Bunting to the side of the canal instead of ramming into the back of Mallard. Tolly poked her head out of the hatch. "Nothing for you to worry about," Dorothy shouted. "I've turned the engine off. Now I'll have to look in the weed hatch and see if I can free whatever it is that's caught up." "Thanks," she added to Elsie, taking the screwdriver she'd asked her to find. She began unscrewing a flat wooden board on the floor of the boat that the girls sometimes sat on when the weather was good. When the top of the hatch was uncovered, Dorothy swore. "Come and look." "It's some kind of rope," said Elsie. "This water's so filthy I can hardly see what's going on down there." Dorothy's arm came out of the box covered with silt and weeds. She grimaced at the smell, and Elsie followed suit. "I'm going to need to lean right in, but first, can you find me something to hack at it with? It feels like it's stuck solid." Dorothy wiped her arm on a rag, then got up and went to the engine's starter motor. She removed the key and put it on the side shelf. "I don't want to lose my arm if a sudden motion restarts the propellers," she said. "These are all I can find." Elsie put down an axe, a bread knife, and a penknife. Dorothy stared hard at her finds. "Is that all?" Elsie nodded. Izzy climbed onto Mallard from Bunting. "Why have we stopped?" "Stuff caught round the propeller," said Elsie. "Go back on Bunting and see if you can find something that I might be able to use to free old rope," Dorothy said urgently. The day was now fading. "I don't want to be messing around in the murky cut in the dark." "Right," said Izzy. It seemed to Dorothy that it got darker by the minute before Izzy slid back onto Mallard. "You're not going to like it, but my offerings aren't much better." She tipped an assortment of kitchen implements on the floor and a small pair of scissors. Dorothy felt like crying. She let out a huge sigh. "I really need something like a strong pair of secateurs. The axe is sharp, but I might damage the propeller and make things worse." They'd never be able to free the rope themselves if these were the best tools they had. "It's no good," she said. "You lot'll have to stay here while I go in search of a village or house with a phone so I can let the base know where we are. Tomorrow, sometime, they'll get to us and sort out this mess." She glared at the open hatch. "I was hoping to make up time we've lost." "What's that, ladies?" "Bloomin' hell! Where'd you spring from?" Dorothy said. A skinny young man with the darkest, curliest head of hair she'd ever seen was hanging over Mallard's rail. "I've been told to run down the towpath to make sure you was all right." His cheeky face broke into a wide smile. "Only you ain't, are ya?" "Who told you to run after us?" Izzy looked terrified. Elsie put her arm around her friend's shoulders. "It's nothing to do with Charlie," she whispered, but Izzy was shaking with fright. "Sonny said to come back and see what was taking you so long to reach the lock and the pub. He saved you a berth near the lock inn." Izzy let out a deep breath, clearly relieved. Dorothy gathered her thoughts. "Who are you?" "Me name's Tommy. I'm off to Birmingham to see me sister." The lad had a broad Cockney accent. Dorothy suddenly remembered Sonny had mentioned him. "You're some relative, aren't you?" she asked. "Sort of," said Tommy. "You going to tell me what's up? I'm losing valuable drinking time chatting to you lot." "We've got some old rope twisted around the propeller and nothing to hack it away with." She was talking to an empty space, for the young man had climbed aboard and was now on all fours peering down the hatch. "That's a bugger, ain't it?" He looked up at them with a grin. "Nicely put. I don't suppose you can help?" Dorothy asked. The boy looked inside the hatch again, more thoughtfully this time. Then he sat back on the deck and asked, "You got anything to cut it with?" Dorothy indicated the implements lying around him. "That's all the sharp things we could find." "I'll have to get back to Sonny," Tommy said, rising and dusting off his brown corduroy trousers. He curled his lip at the bread knife and scissors. "You shouldn't be on the cut if you don't know how to take care of yourselves." With that endearing remark, he jumped from the boat and ran back along the towpath. Dorothy watched him until he was out of sight. I wonder if he'll come back with Sonny. Well, they'd better get here before the light goes, Elsie said. Izzy asked, Shall I put the kettle on? Good idea, Dorothy said, eyeing the hatch with distaste. We'll give the lad half an hour, and if he's not back by then, I'll follow the towpath the way we've come to look for a place with a phone. Oh, don't worry, called Tolly, her head poking up from Bunting's hatch. Elsie could see white stuff on her eyelashes and cheeks. Tolly's eyes were sparkling. Sonny won't let us down. Dorothy raised her eyes heavenwards. Before they'd finished their tea, the lad came back at a run. He was carrying what looked like a long carpet bag. He heaved it over the side of the boat, shouting, Watcha! I thought Sonny might have come. Tolly appeared at Bunting's hatch. She looked disappointed. Tommy blinked at her. He don't need to be here to see me sort you out. He narrowed his eyes. You the bint Alice chasing him? Tolly glared at him and ducked inside Bunting, but not before Dorothy had seen her face redden. Tommy pulled off his shirt, exposing his skinny chest. You better look away, ladies, if you don't want to see a bloke in his drawers. With a single movement he removed his trousers, then opened up the bag and sorted through it, pulling out what looked like a pair of garden shears. He slithered on his bottom towards the hatch and put a foot into the murky water. What are you doing? Dorothy cried. Don't worry. I knows what I'm about. Jesus, this water's cold. He stopped in his tracks. You have taken the key out, ain't you? I don't want to get chopped into dog's meat. Yes, I have, but please be careful, Dorothy begged. Her face showed how distressed she was. But Tommy could no longer hear her, for he'd slipped into the icy water with the shears. She could hear a lot of splashing, and every so often Tommy's wet face, curls bedraggled, popped up, gasped for air, swore, then dived down inside the hatch again. If you ever told me a person could fit into that small space, I'd never have believed you, said Elsie. I do hope he'll be all right. Well, it looks like he's done this sort of thing before, doesn't it? And it's a good job he's built like a rasher of wind, said Dorothy. I'll be eternally grateful to Sonny and his granddad for looking out for us. There was a lot of noise going on below the hatch, and every so often water splashed on the decking as Tommy came up, took another deep breath and disappeared again. Only once did he speak sensibly, and that was to gasp, Bleedin' filthy job this is. Eventually, the shears made an appearance, followed by skinny arms, and then the rest of Tommy. He climbed out of the hole, dripping, then shook himself, like a dog emerging from a pond. He handed the shears to Dorothy. Dry these thoroughly, and, if you can spare it, run the blades over with a bit of Marge. He wiped his face with a free hand. Sonny's very particular about his tools. Try her now. Dorothy said to Elsie, Put the key in and see what happens. The wet lad, his skin goose-pimpled with cold, moved towards the tiller and controls. The boat's propellers whirred into life. Tommy shoved the control to neutral. There you go, like new. OK, best turn it off. You can buy me a pipe when we get to the lock-in. His teeth were chattering, but he was trying to smile. Dorothy, who'd gone below to wipe margarine on the shears blades, shouted up, We can't thank you enough. Come down here for something warm in your insides, and I've got a kettle of hot water for you to wash the filth from your hair and body. I don't want you picking up any diseases from that water. Thanks, Dorothy. It is Dorothy, ain't it? She had just emerged from the cabin holding the greasy shears. She came on deck, bent down and put them in the bag they'd arrived in. Tolly emerged yet again from Bunting's hatch and yelled, We're ever so grateful to Sonny for this. No doubt you'll find a way to thank him, shouted Tommy. Most girls do. Dorothy and Elsie laughed. Tommy dripped towards the steps leading down into the cabin. He turned and said, I'm shutting the door, ladies. I don't want any of you taking a look at me crown jewels. Chapter 22 When Mallard, with Tommy steering, reached the towpath alongside the noisy pub, Tolly said indignantly, "I thought you said Sonny had saved us a space." She looked at the boats hugging the moorings. Already she could smell cigarette smoke on the air and hear laughter. "Well, he can't stay outside and tell people not to moor up, can he? See what he's done? He's pulled the butty in and tied her behind Aurora. So he's taking 2 spaces instead of tying the butty in the water next to Aurora." Tolly could see exactly what he meant, but she didn't like anything obvious being explained to her, especially not by Tommy, who somehow seemed to get under her skin. Not in a bad way, though. There was no harm in him. While they'd been travelling the cut, she'd amazed herself by confiding in him her hopes and dreams of one day owning the Currant Bun and making a success of the cafe. "Take the tiller while I rearrange our boats so you can get in the space behind us." "I was just about to," she replied tartly. He ignored her tone and grinned at her, then jumped out of Mallard. Tolly did as she was told, waving at Elsie, who was steering bunting. Tolly watched Tommy scramble over moored craft. He was a comical person, she thought. Endearing, in a funny sort of way. She wondered how old he was. He looked about 15, but she thought he might be older. Perhaps he was so skinny because he'd grown up without proper food. Aurora's butty was now in midstream, and Tommy was back on Aurora, pulling in the ropes to fasten the 2 boats together, side by side. Tolly made arm movements to Elsie to show her she was attempting to moor in the space vacated by Aurora's butty. Within minutes, Elsie had jumped to the towpath, and both women had moored Mallard and Bunting behind Aurora and her butty. The pub was a few 100 yards away. "You're getting good with that boat, ain't you? And you smells nice." Tolly preened at Tommy's words. She yelled down into the cabin, "We're here!" Dorothy looked up. Tolly saw she'd left her hair in a ponytail instead of its usual bun. "You look nice," she said. "You should wear your hair like that more often." Dorothy smiled and began climbing the stairs. "I'm going to have to thank Sonny and his grandad for looking out for us. We'd have lost a lot of time if we'd had to wait for someone from the base to come out and fix the propeller." "I can't thank you enough," she said to Tommy, who was waiting on the towpath. "Cut people always help folks," he said. He looked meaningfully at Tolly. "Even when they can't stand each other." Usually the gypsies regarded the idle women with suspicion, as Tolly had been told many times. She stuck her tongue out at Tommy and flounced away. "Come on, Izzy," yelled Dorothy. After a few moments, Izzy came to the steps. She, too, had made an effort. Her cloud of bright hair looked like spun gold. "I'm not fussed about drinking, so if Steve-O isn't in the pub, I'm going to read to him." In her hand, she held the Alexandre Dumas book. "He's not on Aurora, else he'd have shouted at me," said Tommy. He thought for a moment. "Well, perhaps not shouted, but he'd have banged with his stick to let me know he was aboard." "Come on, you lot. We're wasting valuable drinking time." Izzy left the novel in the cabin. "Do you think he's even old enough to drink?" whispered Dorothy to Tolly. Tommy must have heard her, for he came back at her. "I'm 19, not bleeding 9. Tolly knew her mouth had fallen open. The young man glared at them both, then stalked off across the grass and gravelled towards the front door of the pub. "I think we've hurt his feelings," said Dorothy. All 4 women were walking towards the noisy bar. Tolly could hear the wireless blaring dance music. She spotted Steve-O nursing a half pint and sitting in his bath chair, and Izzy made a beeline for him, telling Dorothy she wanted cider if they had any. Tolly followed her.
"Hello, sweetheart,"
Steve-O said to Izzy. He had a bit of a cough into his handkerchief, then composed himself.
"The news was on just now, and it seems we've got them German blighters on the run for sure. That's the good news. But our boys keep discovering these concentration camps full of dead and dying prisoners of war.
Before Izzy could reply, Tolly cut in. Where's Sonny? He doesn't seem to be in here.
That's because he's taken Eliza for a walk,
Steve-O said.
What's Eliza? A dog?
Steve-O stared at Tolly, his eyes like ice.
Eliza's the daughter of the landlord here.
Tolly couldn't hide her disappointment. The silence that followed was eventually broken by Tommy, who pushed a glass of beer into Tolly's hands. Take this. Dorothy sent it over. Now, come outside for a minute. He turned to Steve-O. The drinks are on Dorothy. He settled a glass of whiskey in Steve-O's gnarled hand. Sup that up, he said. It will put airs on your chest. Tolly followed the lad to the bar, where he picked up his own pint, took a big gulp, then strode through the smoke-filled room, letting the blackout curtain fall back in the doorway so the light didn't seep out. He walked towards a path at the side of the hostelry that led to a garden, where there were a few wooden benches and tables. He sat down and motioned for her to sit next to him. I don't want to interfere, he said, but it's about Sonny. Well, don't then. Tolly stared at him. How could this lip of a lad know what she was feeling? You're not the only one to have their hearts broken by him. He collects hearts like some blokes collect stamps. Tolly snapped. What do you mean? He broke my heart? He's never even kissed me. The worry on his face dissipated. Well, that's all to the good then. What are you talking about? Tolly was running her finger round the rim of her glass. If he hasn't kissed you, he hasn't laid a finger on you either. No, of course not. What do you take me for? A flush of relief lit Tommy's face. He lifted his glass and swallowed. I takes you for a girl who knows what she wants when the war's over by opening a successful business. A pretty girl with a lush figure who could have her pick of any blokes. If you got any sense, you'll stop making cow eyes at Sonny. He's a relative of mine, but he won't settle for a girl who's not born to the cut. I'm not pretty, said Tolly, and I'm fat. Tommy spluttered into his beer. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. I think you should look in a mirror sometime. And I think you need your head examining. Tell Dorothy I've gone back to the boat. She stormed off, leaving her drink on the table. When she glanced back, he was watching her and shaking his head. Once more on the boat, Tolly refilled the coal bucket and banked up the stove. She thought how lucky they were always to have a supply of wood or coal to use as fuel. Sometimes they borrowed coal from the yards alongside the canal, but mostly the lock keepers helped them out, and there was always wood for the taking from fallen trees. Tolly hadn't come back to the boat just because she was upset that Sonny hadn't shown up that evening. She was furious with Tommy. What right did he have to tell her what she could or couldn't do? She was happiest when she was cooking, and the heaven-sent gift of sugar had kept her busy on bunting while the propeller was being fixed. So what if Sonny was out walking with some girl? Wasn't the way to a man's heart through his stomach? She took the clean tea towels off the delicacies she'd prepared earlier. Bunting didn't possess much in the way of luxury, certainly not a full-length mirror. There was a small square one on the shelf near the stove, and Tolly picked it up. She scrutinised herself. The weeks of running ahead to prepare the locks and a lack of fattening food had defined her face. She had cheekbones. She knew some of her clothes were baggy, and she'd resorted to using safety pins to keep them together. But she wasn't prepared for the shock of seeing herself, or most of herself, when she propped the small mirror against the bunk bed and stood back until she had a fair enough image. She was still curvy, but no longer so overweight that she was ashamed to see her reflection. And then it dawned on her. She had stopped puffing so hard when she had to hurry between locks. At home in Titchfield, walking anywhere, even in the cafe, had done her in. She remembered likening it to pulling tree trunks after her whenever she needed to walk. When had she lost that awful feeling of dragging her weight around? All the recent exercise over the past weeks had toned her. She wouldn't have believed it possible had Tommy not pointed it out. Of course, the lad had never seen her at her heaviest, had he? And he'd said she was, what was it? Lush. That's enough of that, she told herself, taking the mirror and putting it back in its rightful place. Self-praise is no recommendation. Tolly approached the stove. She was happy with her afternoon's work. She'd known exactly what she was going to do with the fallen apples she'd gathered from the orchard. It would be a nice surprise for her friends. And for Sonny. Chapter 23. I don't want to say anything, old chap, but there's egg or something on your tie, and, Eric Tomlin coughed, obviously embarrassed. Geoffrey stared at him. The young man, tipped to join the firm as a junior partner, shuffled papers from his corner desk and dared to look up and into Geoffrey's eyes. It's just that a comment was made and overheard. What kind of comment? Who by? You know I can't say anything. Eric coughed discreetly behind his hand. We're aware you're going through a change of circumstances. Excuse me, Tomlin. May I remind you, you're not yet in a position to speak to me like that. Just then the door opened and Millie, the tea lady, arrived with her trolley. The silence that followed could have been cut with one of Millie's cake knives. She bustled around, pouring tea and offering biscuits, which Geoffrey declined, as his waistline was expanding, due, no doubt, to all the fried food he was being fed. Tomlin held the door open for her to depart, then escaped himself, leaving Geoffrey staring at his cup of weak tea. He peered down at his dark tie. Yes, it did have a large splodge of something resembling egg yolk. How had he not noticed? Elsie would never have allowed him to leave the house less than immaculately dressed. He sighed. Sandra was more bohemian. There was also the matter of the long orange cat hairs covering his trouser legs. He'd taken a boiled egg with bread and butter up to Sandra, who was still asleep, and had left the tray on the bedside table. Elsie would have had a fit if Geoffrey had surprised her with breakfast in bed. Though it wasn't a surprise for Sandra, as he did that small chore most mornings. Now her morning sickness had stopped, she ate voraciously. Eating for two, she called it. He wondered if it had made her balloon with her pregnancy. He'd seen pregnant women at practically full term with smaller bumps than hers. He dressed for work in a hurry this morning, having risen early to tidy the living room. The baby makes me feel tired, Sandra had said when he had asked her about the dead flowers in the blue vase that were giving off a foul smell. I can't do everything. So he'd had a bit of a tidy-up. But the heart had gone out of his once immaculate home. He'd lost heart too, for there had been several possible buyers to look over the property, but as yet no takers, even though he'd dropped the original asking price. Maybe he should take time off and show people around himself. Alverstoke was a sought-after area, and the price was more than fair. Perhaps Sandra's treatment of possible buyers left a lot to be desired. She could be quite off-hand when she wanted. Perhaps they didn't like the terrace she'd created at the front of the house. He didn't see the point in covering half the garden, destroying flowers that Elsie had planted with such care, to leave a swathe of grey concrete upon which a few deck chairs and tables now sat. Who wanted to sit opposite the road anyway? But it made sense not to antagonise Sandra. She could be a positive vixen when crossed, especially after she'd dropped her bombshell last night. She and the doctor had made a mistake, and it was possible the baby would come sooner than anticipated. How wonderful would that be? A son or a daughter of his very own. He wondered if Elsie had received his letter telling her he'd moved back into Western Way. There had been no reply. When he telephoned the Rousham Cruisers base, The stupid woman who'd answered had told him, condescendingly, they were able to forward letters to appropriate places for the crews to pick them up, but Elsie was otherwise engaged. He hated to admit that he missed her. After he'd drunk his tea, Geoffrey pulled off his tie and put it into his waistcoat pocket, then undid the top button of his shirt, thinking clients wouldn't mind his slight state of undress. It was still warm in late September. "Get out from under my feet, you silly dog!" Matey was having great fun pouncing on clods of earth as the spade flicked them over. Jack wiped the sweat from his forehead. Elsie had told him she loved gardening, so he was going to surprise her with a plot big enough for her to plant whatever she liked. He wanted to make it easier for her to cultivate by digging it over first. He ignored the pain in his leg as he stared at the small, chalet-like shed he decorated with leftover paint. Elsie would be able to store her gardening equipment in there. Outside, a small, freshly painted bench faced the sun. The ground at the back of his cottage rolled away to farmland and hills, and Elsie had said how much she liked the peace and quiet of its location. He was excited that she intended to come to him when she'd finished her first round trip. He couldn't believe now he'd had the courage to wait for the canal boat in Oxford, and that he'd actually approached her. Jack bent down and petted the small white dog who wouldn't keep still. "You'd better like your new mistress," he said. "She's a wonderful lady." At the hotel, he and Elsie had poured out their secrets, hopes and fears. He didn't mind admitting he'd been saddened by the news that she couldn't have children. But it was Elsie he wanted. Elsie he'd fallen in love with. And if he could have her, nothing else mattered. What if she didn't like the quiet of his lock cottage? For her, he'd move anywhere, even take up a desk job at the airfield. He'd been offered one, but didn't think it a good idea to accept while he was still suffering from nightmares after the crash. It was different now. With Elsie at his side, he could do anything, even move mountains if she wanted him to. Matey began barking and running towards the canal. A bell rang loudly. "You know before I do, don't you, you silly mutt, when someone wants help with the lock?" Jack limped after his dog.
"Out on bail?"
"They'll never make the charges stick, Joey." Charlie looked the little man up and down.
"Did I hear right? Your Izzy left you?"
"Nah, she's doing a bit of war work. She'd never leave me." Charlie felt the small muscle at the side of his mouth twitch. So that was what people thought, was it? That she'd left him. He didn't like Gosport people knowing he couldn't hold on to Izzy. But the bitch had done a runner before he got picked up by the police. He wondered if she'd had anything to do with that. Nah, wasn't possible, as he never told her what he was up to. "I'll be fetching her soon, Joey. She says she misses me." He thought of the piece of paper in his wallet with her mate Elsie's new address that he'd copied from the original, the day he'd broken into their posh house in Western Way. Where the fuck was Izzy? She needed teaching a lesson for making him look a right bloody fool, didn't she? He hadn't found her at Lower Hayford or at Limehouse Basin in London. But he would find the bitch. He was driving back up to Oxfordshire at the weekend, and when he discovered her whereabouts on the canal, he'd make her sorry she'd run off.
My darling, it's been 8 days since we've had any food. Water is still available, and I'm sure that's what's keeping me alive. That and the hope I will see you again. Some of the other prisoners aren't so lucky. I tried to take water to a man I'd grown quite close to after losing... I can't even remember my friend's name. His body still lies by the fence. The man was totally dehydrated. I'd managed to find a tin to collect water for him, but the rust made it red. I had to pass by the bodies of little children who had been clubbed. Little bodies with their heads dented and caved in. I was told the end of the war was in sight. How could anyone know that? Certainly not these skeletons in blue and white rags. I think if the Germans could do that, kill innocent children, they would never bother to send letters home for us. It's a terrible thing to know you're going to die, and no one will know. Jakub.
Chapter 24. Tolly could hear the girls laughing as they climbed aboard Mallard. One tripped, causing yet more giggles. The scent of spices filled the air in Bunting, and she guessed, any moment now, the others would call over to her.
Tolly, you wizard thing, come here!
It was Dorothy's voice. Tolly knew that once they'd left the pub, they would return to Mallard for a final cup of cocoa. She stood on the stairs and looked out of Bunting's hatch.
Enjoy it,
she called. Then,
don't let Izzy eat it all. There's another apple pie here for us. Aren't you coming aboard?
The boats were lashed together, and it would take but a moment for Tolly to step over the ropes onto Mallard. But she had other plans.
Has the pub turned out now? Did Steve-O get home safe?
Tolly wasn't particularly worried about Steve-O, but she wondered if Sonny was back.
Of course,
said Dorothy, poking her head out of Mallard's hatch.
Guess what? Izzy's been given a bag of stuff that belonged to someone called Sarah. Sonny's grandmother.
Tolly had remembered who Sarah was. Dorothy smiled at her.
Sure you don't want to come in with us for a while?
Tolly shook her head. Dorothy said,
Thanks again for the apple pie. I can't wait to dig in.
And then she was gone, leaving Tolly to stare along the dark waterway. For a moment she listened to the night sounds. The sound of a glass shattering inside the pub broke her thoughts. Smiling to herself, she went down the stairs to reappear moments later with a covered, fragrant dish. Carefully, Tolly stepped over the ropes and slid past the now closed hatch and Mallard's door, then onto the towpath. All she was aware of was the sound of her shoes on the gravel. It was a boat length to reach Aurora, and when Tolly climbed aboard, she could hear voices coming from the cabin. The door was closed because of the blackout, so she knocked, carefully holding the pie in her arms. When the door opened, she slipped inside while Tommy slid back the blackout curtain. Tolly looked about her. Steve-O sat in his usual seat near the fire, and Tommy gave her a warm smile.
This is a nice surprise, he said. What you got under that tea towel? Sonny not here?
Tolly had no need to look about her in such a small place, for it was obvious that only Steve-O and Tommy were on board.
He's out with his girl.
The words fell from Steve-O's mouth. He was staring at Tolly.
By gum, that smells good.
Tolly's hands were shaking as she passed the dish to Tommy.
We had a bit of luck with getting hold of some extra sugar, so I made some pies. Thought you'd all like to share this.
Tommy took the warm dish from her.
That's really kind of you.
Tolly stared at him. It seemed to her that his eyes could see right inside her. He knew she'd made the pie especially for Sonny, who had committed the sin of not being there to receive it. Worse still, the old man had let slip Sonny was still out with the girl from the pub. Tommy whipped off the tea towel and gave a long, low whistle.
Would you look at that, Steve-O? Been a long time since anyone's cared about our innards.
The browned top was thick with sugar.
You gonna sit and have a cuppa with us, love?
Steve-O asked. Tolly knew she could no more drink tea than fly to the moon.
I won't if you don't mind. Dorothy's been talking about getting a move on towards Blissworth Tunnel with a really early start.
Well, it was a half-truth, Tolly thought. Dorothy had mentioned the tunnel. Steve-O nodded knowingly.
Well, we'll all need our wits about us going through that haunted place, he said.
Steve-O, you stop that. No need to scare the poor girl. Tommy put the pie carefully on a shelf. Want me to walk back with you? Tolly had now regained her poise and brushed away her disappointment at not seeing Sonny. It's only next door, she said. Steve-O chipped in.
Has Izzy looked in the bag I sent over?
If she has, she said nothing yet to me of what she's found. Tolly turned to walk up the steps. I'll say good night. Out in the night air, she took a deep breath and began the short walk back to Mallard and Bunting. Only she didn't stop at the moored boats. She was telling herself Sonny had every right to go out with whoever he chose. Even so, it had been a blow to her that he hadn't come back to Aurora with the other two. She took another deep breath, then let out the air slowly. A short walk along the towpath would clear her head. There was no reason that Sonny should think of her in a romantic way, she tried to tell herself. Yes, a walk would make her feel better. After all, if Izzy was back in Bunting now, there was no way Tolly could stand listening to her happy chatter. She had to admit she felt hurt. Why? Surely Tolly had made apple pies for everyone. No. The truth was, Tolly had baked a pie especially for Sonny. The other pies had been an afterthought. She'd made them to use up the apples and sugar, and she knew the girls would appreciate them. She wanted Sonny to look her in the eyes and say thank you, and know she'd made it just for him. Why didn't Sonny want her? He must know how she felt about him. She looked just as pretty as some of the girls she knew he'd been with. She'd lost weight and looked better for it. Hadn't Tommy told her so? She thought she could make him notice her by cooking for him. But it had all backfired, hadn't it? Tolly stepped around a puddle left from the last rain. She didn't want to walk too far along the towpath in the dark. Through the gloom, the shape of the lock loomed ahead. Turning back, she heard a rustle in the undergrowth, then a giggle, a man's voice, coaxing, gentle. Tolly recognised that voice. It was Sonny's. She moved quickly, not bothering that the tears in her eyes were obscuring her vision, and ran back along the gravelled path towards the moored boats. Chapter 25. No, Dorothy exclaimed. This is the right way to do it. She pulled the hooked tool through the canvas, dragging the piece of cut flowered material with it, Izzy watching her carefully.
I can do that,
Izzy yelled, once the tool and material were back in her hands. Dorothy watched for a few seconds. Then she leaned across and slipped another log into Mallard's stove. The scent of pine was filling the cabin. Didn't take you long to get the hang of that, did it? You're fairly ripping along the lines now. Good for you. Dorothy smiled at Izzy. Her red hair curled around her face, and her determination showed as she methodically pulled piece after piece of cut cloth through the holes in the sacking, making the rug grow.
Wasn't it kind of Steve-O to give this to me? Sarah started it,
she said, then went on without waiting for Dorothy to reply.
I really like doing it. It's kind of soothing as well as being productive.
Yes, well, you can't sit in here all day making a rag rug. There's locks outside that need opening, and work to do on board, and bridges that need lifting.
Yeah,
chanted Izzy. Rug making had taken her mind off the very real possibility that Charlie was looking for her. Dorothy blessed Steve-O. Anyway, I need to ask whether you've decided to join me in a second trip.
We haven't finished this one yet.
I need to know because at the office they'll be sifting through new inquiries from other women. If I've a full quota, they won't need me to take on newcomers and we can stay together.
In that case, count me in.
She looked at Dorothy.
In fact, I don't know when I've ever felt so happy, even if it is hard work.
Dorothy said a silent prayer of relief, but to Izzy she said, Thank you. She'd already asked Tolly, who'd agreed to stay on. Her only worry was Elsie, who, from the time she woke until the time she went to bed, spoke about Jack and what she was going to do at the cottage when her tour of work finished. Izzy seemed to read her thoughts, for she said,
Elsie is so lucky to have found someone who obviously adores her, isn't she?
Dorothy thought of the letter she kept beneath her pillow. She lived in fear of one of the girls finding it, but she needed it with her because it was all she had left of Jakub. She answered Izzy's question with a smile. Elsie deserves to be loved. Since Dorothy had invited Izzy to stay with her in Southampton at her mother's house, she should probably tell the younger girl about herself, but it was easier to put things off. The weeks they'd all worked together on the cut had made the women firm friends. It was only Dorothy who couldn't share her feelings so easily and openly. How would her three friends feel if they knew what she'd done? If they knew the lie she was living? She wished she'd never offered Izzy a few days' break at her home, but she couldn't allow her to go back to Gosport, where it was more than possible her ex-boyfriend Charlie might find her and hurt her again. She thought of little Alfie. Into everything he was. Slow to walk and talk, but that, she thought, was a blessing in disguise at present. She wondered if she'd be able to find something suitable as a present for him. There were hardly any toys in the shops now. Near the tunnel ahead, there was a shop that sold all sorts of domestic and canal paraphernalia. She'd seen toy cars in there, wooden ones made by a local woodcarver. Perhaps they might have something suitable for a small boy. She wondered, too, if she dared ask Tolly to make a cake for Alfie. Tolly was never happier than when she was baking, and they had plenty of sugar still from the spillage at Limehouse, even though they'd given some to Steve-O. Dorothy sighed. If she asked Tolly to make a cake, she would have to lie when she said who it was for. It was best she said nothing. "I'm sorry, but I really need to lie down for a while." The disembodied voice floated down into the cabin. Izzy blew out her cheeks and put her rug-making to one side.
I'd better go and relieve Elsie at the tiller. She was very pale this morning.
When Izzy had taken over, Elsie was most apologetic. "I'm sorry, Dorothy, but I feel really rough." Dorothy put down the paperwork she was trying to sort through and pulled out the bunk bed. Elsie looked like a ghost. "I hope what you've got isn't catching," she said. "Get in your sleeping bag and try to rest. Do you want a cup of tea?" She looked at Elsie worriedly. "Oh, no, that's the last thing I need." Elsie practically collapsed on her bunk. "I just feel so peculiar. I mean, I loved that apple pie Tolly made, but in the morning, I brought it all up. You don't think there was something wrong with it, do you? I wasn't ill, and neither was Izzy. And when I had a word with the old man, he was full of praise for Tolly's baking. So was Tommy. I reckon you're having a bilious attack. Will you be all right if I leave you on your own and take over the steering of Bunting? I think Tolly could do with a break." Dorothy looked at Elsie, whose eyes were closed. She didn't reply, so Dorothy went up top, closing the door to keep the heat in the cabin. "Slow down," she said to Izzy. "Let Bunting nudge up against us at the rear, and I'll be able to change places with Tolly. She can come and annoy you. I'd rather be on my own. I'm fed up with her moaning about Sonny. Trouble is, it's all in her head. To the best part of my knowledge, Sonny's never made a move on her, so she's got no reason to think she could be his next fancy woman." Izzy stepped aside so Dorothy could handle the tiller.
"She kept me awake," she said, "with her snivelling, because he was in the bushes with some young woman from the Lock Inn."
Dorothy relented. Tolly hasn't had much experience with men.
"Meaning you've had plenty yourself?"
Dorothy knew Izzy didn't mean to hurt her with words that were hastily said. She turned away, looking across at the fields and trees without really seeing them. Tears rose to her eyes and she blinked them away. She was going to have to let Izzy into her secret. Would Izzy still have respect for her when she knew the truth? At her initial meeting with both Izzy and Elsie, Dorothy had known the two women could keep secrets. Mentally, she crossed her fingers. Her job could be at stake here.
Actually, I do know about men and losing the man you love.
Izzy was staring at her wide-eyed, but before either of them could say another word, the sound of Elsie being sick interrupted them. Dorothy sighed.
Look after the boat. I'll see to Elsie.
The smell of vomit assailed her as she went down into the cabin. Elsie was sitting up in her bunk, mortified.
I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to.
The words mixed with her tears. Dorothy fetched a bowl and shoved it at her.
Aim for that next time,
she said tartly. She poured water onto an old piece of cloth and began mopping up the stinking mess on the floor. Elsie was crying hard now. She tried to get up.
Stay there,
warned Dorothy. She'd thrown the dirty cloth overboard and dunked the floor mop into the canal. She sprinkled San-Isel disinfectant liberally and began scrubbing the floorboards. When she was satisfied everything was sanitary, she rinsed the mop in the cut, then hoisted it onto the outside roof of the cabin, its usual resting place, to dry out.
Is she all right?
Izzy said.
Well, I'm certain what she's suffering from won't kill her,
Dorothy said, ducking back into the cabin, this time leaving the door open.
The heat from the stove will soon dry everything out,
she said to Elsie.
Tell me when you first began to feel sick.
Her voice was soothing now.
Yesterday morning, answered Elsie. But it went away, and then I felt fine. It came back this morning.
Dorothy sat down on the edge of Elsie's bunk. She picked up one of Elsie's hands and held it tightly. She looked into her eyes and said,
I may be mistaken, but it rather sounds as if you may be pregnant.
Elsie said,
I can't be. I only went to bed with Jack that once in Oxford. Geoffrey and I have tried all our married life for a baby. We all thought it was my fault I couldn't conceive.
Elsie stopped babbling. A look of wonderment crossed her face. Dorothy said,
But it wasn't Geoffrey you were sleeping with in a hotel in Oxford, was it?
Chapter 26.
Haven't you finished reading that blessed book to the old man yet? The Man in the Iron Mask is a good story, but Steve-O usually falls asleep after a few pages. He loses concentration easily.
Perhaps it's your boring voice. Izzy threw a spoon at Tolly.
Ouch!
She yelled.
Come on, children, play nicely, Dorothy remonstrated. Whatever would Elsie think if she knew you two were squabbling like kids?
She'd think it was normal, said Tolly. After all, we're waiting around doing very little, so Jack can take her into Lower Hayford to see that doctor she liked. Tolly tailed off while she tried to remember.
Dr. Wells, yes, that's his name. I've never seen a man so happy that he might become a dad, said Izzy, though Elsie can't quite believe it's true.
End of CD 5. CD 6. Well wrapped up against a chill wind, the girls were sitting at the rear of Mallard, glad that the rain had stopped and a weak sun had broken through.
Of course not. After 10 years of trying for a baby and nothing happening, you'd not think it was possible either. When Elsie started being sick, that was only part of it. Her breasts hurt, and she said she felt tired all the time.
Dorothy paused.
Those symptoms are a giveaway. I'm so happy for her.
She sounded as though she was remembering something. Then she snapped back into leader mode.
We won't go through Blissworth Tunnel until Elsie's back. It's easier this side of the tunnel for Jack to find us. We're all keeping our fingers crossed that she's pregnant. But won't this hanging about mess up your calculations for how long this round trip should take?
Izzy asked Dorothy.
As long as the loads get to Birmingham, we do have some leeway.
Dorothy sighed.
Of course, it means that Jack will want to take care of her and straight away move her into the Lock Cottage. She won't do that,
Izzy broke in.
Is there something you're not telling me?
Dorothy knew Elsie was especially close to Izzy, and of course the two would share secrets because they'd known each other long before they became narrowboat women.
She won't mind me telling you,
Izzy answered. Dorothy and Tolly stared at her expectantly.
Of course Jack will want her to move in with him, but it mightn't be for a while. As you know, her husband is selling their house and a flat in Alverstoke that he bought for the woman he's now living with, who's moved into Elsie's house with him.
There were murmurs of disgust from Dorothy and Tolly.
Elsie thinks her husband might drag things out if he finds out about Jack, and especially about the baby.
Izzy frowned.
She told me she would sign on with you, Dorothy, for another trip.
Dorothy was smiling and couldn't stop herself saying, "Oh, damn good show."
Well, Elsie reckons having a baby is a natural function, and during the first half of her pregnancy, there's no reason why she shouldn't work.
I hope she asks the doctor and gets the go-ahead on that, put in Tolly.
I'm sure she will,
Izzy said.
It's one of the questions on her list. You see, if she moves in with Jack immediately, she's worried her husband won't keep his promise to give her half the money from the sale of the house. She said Jack wouldn't care about the money. He'd take her with the clothes on her back, but she thinks she deserves to get what she's owed. Geoffrey was at fault for making his girlfriend pregnant.
Then he should pay her, shouted Tolly.
All Elsie wants is time to sort out her life with Jack and to have what Geoffrey promised. She really loved him and her home. Of course, that's in the past now, she added. What she's worried about is whether the doctor will say it's fine for her to stay on with us for a while.
Yes, but if Dr. Wells says... Izzy interrupted.
Elsie and I chatted about her work on the narrowboats, how excited she is about the baby and how her love for Jack is very different from her feelings in the past for Geoffrey. Geoffrey cares about Geoffrey. Jack loves Elsie, and it's about time she had some happiness. Ultimately, you two will be told of her decisions, but I know she won't mind me sharing all this with you.
I'm pleased you have, said Dorothy. I'm more than happy to have you all for a second trip. We have to unload this cargo and pick up another. Coal, this time from Birmingham to Banbury, then get back to Lower Hayford. Before anyone had time to say what they thought, a boat's horn sounded. Dorothy looked back the way they'd already travelled, and was surprised to see Aurora and her butty boat sailing along the cut.
I thought they were ahead of us,
said Izzy. Again the horn sounded. I don't think he's hailing us for the fun of it. I think something's wrong, said Dorothy. We'll soon find out. He'll be here in a moment, Tolly said. When the boats drew level, Sonny was at Aurora's tiller, his face like granite. Tommy allowed the butty to drift against Aurora and jumped aboard Mallard. He looked tired and drawn. The old man took a turn for the worse last night, Izzy said quickly.
Have you called a doctor out to him?
Tommy looked at her glumly. No point in calling out doctors when we all know the end is near. What do you mean? Asked Dorothy. He's been living on borrowed time for ages, but he coughed up a heap of blood in the night. We need to get to Braunston. He's got family there and memories. Is he conscious? Dorothy again. Yeah, Tommy nodded. He should be in a hospital, Tolly said sharply. Us boat gypsies don't have no time for hospitals. We takes care of our own.
So who's with him now?
Izzy was frantic. He's asleep. Izzy looked to Dorothy for confirmation. She nodded. Tolly can steer bunting. I'll take this boat and you two can steer your own craft. Izzy, get on Aurora and see what you can do to help. Izzy threw Dorothy a grateful look, then asked,
Will Elsie find us?
For God's sake, woman, if a grown man and woman can't spot 4 narrowboats going slowly along a canal, there must be something very wrong with their eyesight. Take what you need from here and get on Aurora. Thanks, missus, Tommy managed. Me and Sanny was hoping you'd let Izzy come aboard. The old man likes her, and he needs someone with him while we carries on to Braunston. Dorothy looked over to Sonny, whose face was impassive. He hadn't said a word, but he raised a hand in greeting. "Don't take no notice of him. He worships that old man and can't find a way to put his feelings into words." Dorothy sniffed. "I know a lot of people like that," she said softly. "Let's get going, girls." After bathing Steve-O's face and forehead, Izzy read to him while he lay in his bunk on board Aurora. It didn't matter that he slept and might not hear her voice. The old man's heavy breathing filled the small living space. Izzy made tea and took mugs to Tommy and Sonny. Sonny had upped the speed of the boat to press on quickly to Braunston. A few short weeks ago, Izzy had never dreamed she'd be clambering over boats while they moved along the canal, or that she'd be breaking her heart because she knew she was about to lose someone she'd grown very fond of. Izzy directed her words at Sonny.
"You want to go to him? Tommy and I can manage the boats."
He looked at her gratefully. Sonny stayed in the cabin with his grandfather for a long while. He came up the steps as the sky was darkening. "I don't think we'll make Braunston tonight," he said. "We can't travel with the lights on because of the blackout. It's his brother Sol he wants to see. They had a meeting at the Lock Inn. Sol had come up by car." Izzy remembered she'd been introduced to an old man with salt and pepper hair in the pub. She also remembered that had been the night Tolly had become upset because Sonny had gone off with the girl. She kept that to herself.
"Should I go and sit with him again?"
Sonny's eyes softened. "Did he tell you my grandmother Sarah used to read to him?"
"Many times,"
said Izzy. She put her hand to her mouth.
"Oh, I meant to tell him I'd mastered rug making with Dorothy's help. Steve-O gave me some stuff that used to belong to Sarah."
Sonny smiled at her. "You remind him of her," he said. He looked into the gunmetal sky. "I'm tying up in a bit," he added.
"I'm sure Dorothy will want to stop for the night as well,"
said Izzy.
"Before you tie up, I'll sit a while longer with Steve-O."
She didn't wait for a reply, but went back down into the cabin and the tiny stool near the bunk. She picked up the old man's hand, the skin like parchment.
"You're the only man I've ever been able to talk to and not be afraid of,"
she whispered. The terrible, long drawn-out breaths continued. She couldn't bear it, the waiting until another breath started, but hated even more the thought that another wouldn't come. His mouth had fallen open. She used her other hand to brush back the thin hair from his forehead. Once, she surmised, he had been every bit as good-looking as Sonny. The life he'd lived had left its mark. Sarah had been a lucky woman to be loved by this man, Izzy thought. Each time a breath was wrung from him, she thought it might be his last. Izzy laid her head on his cold hand. "I'll take over now." She hadn't noticed or heard Sonny enter the cabin. He put his hand on her shoulder. Izzy had been so deep in thought she'd not felt Aurora rock as the two men had tied the boats together and moored for the night. Without a word, Izzy got up and Sonny took her place. It was time to return to her own boat. As she stepped onto the towpath, Tommy called good night, but she didn't reply. None of the girls felt like cooking a meal, so that evening they had cocoa and chunks of bread and jam. It was 3 a.m. when Dorothy woke Izzy from a fitful sleep. She had bunked in with her, taking Elsie's sleeping bag. The gentle knock on the cabin door had woken her. Tommy, his face grey, his eyes red, told them. "He's gone." Izzy said,
"I'll go and see Sonny."
She began pulling a jumper over her pyjamas. Tommy stilled her. "He don't want no one. Not even me. He'll sit with Steve-O till morning. Sonny's in a bad way. Best we leave him. It's what we do." Tears poured down Izzy's face. Chapter 27. Elsie returned to a subdued crew. Jack and she were ecstatic because the doctor had confirmed her pregnancy. She had persuaded Jack that she would stay with Dorothy for at least another trip, or until she had had favourable news from Geoffrey on the sale of her beloved house. "When we reach Stoke Bruin, we can pick up any post that's been forwarded for us," said Dorothy. Tolly's sister Reggie often wrote with news of what went on in Titchfield. Dorothy only received missives from the Grand Union Canal Company. Izzy sometimes had letters from her mother, but Charlie's name was never mentioned. Sonny visited Mallard and Bunting as soon as it was light. He had brought with him the man in the iron mask. "First, I need to thank you, Dorothy, for your kindness," he said. "I've washed and laid out my grandfather, and soon he'll be laid to rest with Sarah. Steve-O would want Izzy to have this. I hope you'll allow Izzy to stop a while in Braunston. Boatmen's marriages and funerals are held there. You'll be sailing through anyway, and my grandfather has left her something besides this book. Steve-O's brother will meet us there to hand it over. 10 in the morning, the Green Man. I can't ask you to stay for the funeral, as by the time we've notified relatives and arranged everything, you'll have overshot your deadline for the company." He paused. "Anyway, it wouldn't be fitting. We're not your kind of people." The gypsies did things their own way. Dorothy looked into his finely chiselled face, his red curls hovering on his forehead, brown eyes red-rimmed, and she knew that the death of his grandfather had hit him hard. "I'm sure Izzy will agree. I'll talk to her later." She didn't want to wake Izzy, for she'd cried herself to sleep in Elsie's sleeping bag. He nodded towards the book. "It meant a lot to my granddad that she sat with him." Dorothy said, "I often wondered why you didn't read to him, or that he didn't finish it himself." He stared at her. "Steve-O never learned to read. Nor did I." Dorothy allowed his confession to wash over her. "But I've watched you in pubs, chalking figures and numbers on the scoreboards." He shook his head. "Doesn't mean a thing. I got a quick brain, and you don't need to know how to read to add up scores." "But place names, notices along the cut." "Bless you, us gypsies have been brought up on the water, and we know it like the back of our hands. No need to read stuff that doesn't bother us." "You've never enjoyed a novel, then?" He shook his head, and his glistening curls bounced. "Why would I need to read about made-up stuff? Real life is so much better." "But Steve-O appreciated Izzy reading to him." He smiled, showing his strong white teeth. "She reminded him of Sarah. My grandma could read and write, and she often shared whatever she was reading." Dorothy had the feeling that their conversation was at an end. After all, there was nothing more for her to say, and Sonny was moving from one foot to the other, obviously wanting to leave. "Will you ask Izzy?" he said. Dorothy nodded. "Of course I will. And she'll be there." Tunnels and locks came and went. Flights of locks that climbed hills and tunnels so long it was eerie going through them, even with the lights on. The 4 boats sailed within shouting distance of each other. Sometimes when they stopped, Tommy boarded Mallard and told them tales of the ghosts of navvies killed when the tunnels were being excavated. He talked of the men who lay on their backs on top of the narrow boats and walked the craft through the tunnels to save the boaters from treading through the canal muck when there was no room alongside for the horses to pull the craft. Legging, he called it. Dorothy noticed the girls were more than tired. The round of hard work and daily boating chores were taking their toll. That and Steve-O's death. Braunston was a canal village. Boat builders, woodworkers, canopy makers, hull blackers, rope and fender merchants, all types of trade were plied there, and it was a hub of activity. Aurora and her butty went in ahead of Mallard and Bunting. Tommy had told Dorothy that Sonny would need a death certificate, and there would be lots of paperwork to attend to, so that Steve-O could be laid to rest after a good send-off. "I wasn't born on the Cat. I had schooling," he said. "I'll help sort everything." Dorothy and the girls watched the 2 boats containing their sad cargo move into a disused arm. "Look at the crowd of people waiting to meet them," said Tolly. "The news must have got about somehow." It had begun to rain again. After mooring just outside the village and eating a pot of stew, not one of the girls felt like going out. But Izzy had a scrub down in soapy water in the cabin. At least tomorrow she would be clean. Her clothes weren't up to much. Most had shrunk or become misshapen since she'd been living on the canals. But she sorted out the best of them, intending to look as decent as possible to meet Steve-O's brother. Izzy tossed and turned all night in her own bunk on bunting. What could Steve-O's brother want with her? Tolly had been extremely quiet. She'd attended to her chores aboard the boat, but there seemed to be an unspoken barrier between her and Izzy. Izzy, well aware of Tolly's unrequited passion for Sonny, wondered if jealousy was at the bottom of it. It had been Izzy Sonny had asked to come aboard to sit with Steve-O. Eventually morning came, and after breakfast, Dorothy and Izzy walked back along the towpath to Braunston, to the cobbled square and the Green Man. During the night the rain had stopped, and now a weak sun pushed through the clouds. Everything smelt fresh and new. A pony and trap stood outside the pub with no driver. The piebald had a nosebag and was munching happily. Izzy patted it, but Dorothy gave it a wide berth. "You better look inside the pub. At least you can remember what Sol looks like, which is more than I can," Dorothy said. "Ah, on time, I see. I like that." A small man, whom Izzy recognised as Sol, thanks to his resemblance to Steve-O, was emerging from the wide wooden doors of the pub. He went to the trap and unclipped a step at the side. "Easier for you both to climb up," he said, smiling. He ushered them into the open interior, where Dorothy and Izzy sat opposite one another on padded wooden seating. "I'm sorry about your brother," Izzy said. Sol had climbed up into the driving seat after unhooking the pony's nosebag and setting it aside. "It was to be expected," said the man. "Call me Sol. May I call you Izzy?" She nodded. "And you must be Dorothy. Are you both comfortable enough?" He didn't wait for a reply, but shook the reins, and the pony began clip-clopping over the cobbles. Izzy stole a look at Dorothy, who smiled back at her. The pony pulled the trap through the busy village, then alongside the canal. "I couldn't ask you to meet me at our destination," Sol said. "It's difficult to find, unless you're from these parts. Sarah liked the peace and quiet, you see." "I don't understand," began Izzy. "You don't have to, girlie. Steve-O told me it was a very home for you." At the word home, Izzy stared hard at Dorothy, who, she could see, was just as puzzled. She looked through the trees at the ribbon of canal that sparkled. Now the sun was trying to cheer it up. Late autumn fruits grew on the bushes in the lane, which was barely more than a track. Trees met overhead, and the little trap was bouncing along beneath a canopy of branches. Sol stopped the pony with a click of his tongue in a clearing. After climbing down, he came around and reset the step so they could alight onto the grass. He helped them both down. He was dressed in the traditional boatman's garb of corduroy trousers, open-necked shirt and braces. "Off you go." He pointed through the trees at an overgrown path, and Izzy stared at him. "It's best you see her first." He chuckled. "Steve-O would have liked to watch your face the first time you set eyes on her." Izzy set off full of curiosity, with Sol and Dorothy following. The grassy path led down to the cut. Alongside the towpath and backing into trees was a small fenced garden. Part of it was overgrown, but it was easy to see someone had had a go at cutting the grass. A water tap was set in concrete. A washing line was hanging lengthways. A narrow boat was tied to mooring stakes buried in the towpath. It was quite short, barely 40 foot long. Izzy could see it wasn't like an ordinary narrow boat. The canvas cover had been done away with, and a wooden roof made the boat totally enclosed, except for the back where the tiller rose like a long-necked swan. The shiny black paintwork was covered with bright, traditional paintings of castles and roses. Izzy drew in her breath. The boat's name, Jonquil, was adorned with tiny roses.
What a pretty little thing,
Izzy cried. See that brass chimney? Put your hand just inside the top and you'll find the key. Sol ambled over to stand beside the women. Izzy scrambled along the side rail and climbed onto the roof. She waved the key in the air.
Got it?
She cried. Whose boat is this? Dorothy asked. It was Sarah's, but Steve-O has left it to Izzy.
What?
Dorothy was shaken. Surely he can't do that. Don't see why not. He's been looking after its upkeep all these years. She's been out of the water, and she's had her bottom recorked. Lovely and dry inside she is. Izzy was sliding down to the door. She inserted the key in the lock. The door had a tiny stained glass window. Then she was inside the boat and looking around her in amazement. It was nothing like the freight craft she and the others were living on. She stood gazing at the stove in the corner of what was obviously the main living area. There was a comfortable sofa and a shelf full of books, and as she walked over the colourful rag rugs strewn about the varnished boards, she saw a separate area, which was given over to a small stone sink and a tap. Shelves and cupboards formed this space into a sort of kitchen. Everything was clean and tidy. In fact, it looked as if the owner had just popped out for a moment. She could smell dried flowers. Looking about, she saw dishes of potpourri placed on shelves. As she went past the sink, she kicked against a small, raised oval rubber protuberance set into the floor. She stepped on it, and there was a sort of sucking noise. Izzy turned on the tap, and water fell into the sink. It took Izzy a few moments to realise that the rubber oval flushed the sink and emptied it. There must be a refillable water tank somewhere, hidden from view, she thought. Excitement rose in her. Sarah had obviously decided she would not use buckets. Pushing open another narrow door, she walked into a bedroom. Not with hidden bunks, but a real wooden bed. It wasn't made up, but a folded pile of blankets was topped by a patchwork quilt. There was even a mirror screwed to the wall and a chest of drawers. Izzy heard voices and turned to see Sol and Dorothy in the living area.
This is so lovely, Sol. Proper home.
Sol began to laugh.
It's yours now, love.
Izzy was sure she'd misheard him, but Sol was still talking. The little Lister engine has been looked after and all. Steve-O wanted you to have this boat. He said you were so much like Sarah, you'd appreciate it. You can go where you wants, whenever you wants. He never did get round to clearing out her work stuff. There's still rugs and bits and bobs she'd made to hawk from place to place lying around in here. He thought maybe you'd make some use of them too. Izzy was dumbfounded.
I can't possibly.
Oh, yes, you can. It was what he wanted.
But doesn't Sonny have any say in the matter?
Ain't Sonny's boat. It was Sarah's. Besides, Sonny's now got Aurora, her butty, and 4 other boats and crews as well. He's only too pleased to have this one off his hands, so he won't have to spend out on it to keep it up to scratch. Izzy moved quickly towards Sol and enfolded him in her arms.
You don't know what this means to me,
she said. He smelt of pipe tobacco and peppermints. Don't make no mind what I thinks, he said. Steve-O knew you better than you knows yourself. Dorothy had tears in her eyes, but Izzy was crying so much with happiness she couldn't hear the rest of his words. Chapter 28. Geoffrey approached the back of the house in Weston Way. A puncture on the way to work had meant he'd had to contact the garage, who'd promised to collect his car from Foster Gardens, change the wheel, repair the tyre, and return it in the morning. Can't it be done any sooner? He'd asked. No, had been the mechanic's flat reply. He had then quoted Geoffrey what seemed to him an exorbitant price for the repair and collection of his vehicle. Geoffrey had slammed down the office telephone, and not feeling in the mood for clients, had consequently caught a bus home earlier than usual, getting off at Alverstoke and walking the rest of the way. He'd left his car keys for the mechanic and forgotten to remove his house keys from the keyring. A chill autumn wind bit into his cheeks as he strode along, kicking angrily at the brown and yellow leaves now lying on the pavement. He intended to write a letter, care of the address Elsie had given him, telling her he now had money to send her as her share of the Western Way home. Not that he had managed to find a buyer for it yet, but he had been lucky enough to sell the flat in the Crescent. The money for that dwelling would equal Elsie's share in the marital home. He thought she would appreciate a handwritten letter rather than a typed missive from his secretary. The bicycle looked new. It was propped against the wall near the front door, and, as he inched around it, he wondered who it belonged to. Something told him not to barge into the house. He wanted to know if the bike's owner was inside. Most of his friends owned cars. They would have no need to call on him during the day, knowing the hours he worked. He shut his eyes to the desecration of the garden. Sandra had had so many plans to change the layout, and had engaged various people to cut down bushes and cement over flower plots. Alas, her plans hadn't matured to fruition. Not that he'd protested. He wanted Sandra to be happy and content with the house for as long as they lived there. He also thought any garden renovation would add profit to the place. Now he realised what a shambles it had become in the short months Elsie had been gone. He was glad he had the money in his account to pay off his wife. He would hate her to come back to Gosport and see her beloved garden in this state. Last night there had been an air raid on Portsmouth, and unhappily Gosport had suffered. Piles of locally made red bricks had lined the streets this morning. The smell of cordite hung in the air. Keist's, a shop not far from his office, was now rubble. It looked as if a bomb had also descended on his garden. He heard Sandra laugh as his hand twisted the new handle on the unlocked back door. He stepped inside. The laugh had come from the living room. He could now hear faint music from the wireless. In the sink, the breakfast dishes were piled up and the tap dripped over encrusted fat. Quietly he moved towards the open living room door and peeped inside. Sandra half lay, half sat on a brocade sofa. She was still in her nightwear. A satin dressing gown, the same creamy colour as her nightdress, was hiked up above her plump hips, showing the roundness of her pregnancy and the hand of the dark-haired man who was fondling her private parts. Geoffrey wanted to rush into the room and hit out at the unknown man, but he couldn't move, as Sandra murmured contentedly, then squeezed her legs together, trapping the hand, while she leaned into the man and kissed his well-shaped mouth. Geoffrey, his heart beating so fast and loudly that he thought the pair would hear it, felt sickened. Last night, when he had suggested to Sandra in bed that they had sex, she had complained that she felt unwell. She didn't seem to be unwell now. He stepped back and retraced his steps into the garden. He knew he wouldn't be seen, as his garden led down to Stanley Park and wasn't overlooked. He unlocked the small gate that led into the park and allowed the autumn colours to swallow him. He walked blindly, without caring where his steps led him. He made no sound as the tears rolled down his cheeks. All he could think of was that he had stupidly squandered everything he'd ever wanted and worked for.
"You're not cross that Dorothy came with me instead of you?"
Izzy looked into Elsie's face to make sure she really wasn't upset, and was relieved when Elsie gave her a hug. The white tea towel waved in the air like a flag. They were washing up after corned beef hash and peas. "If I'd come, I'd have wanted you to take me for a trip down the cut in your boat. Imagine how cross Dorothy would have been about that. We're behind time as it is, so she says."
"I don't know that I'd dare up moorings and just take off."
"But that's exactly why Steve-o left Jonquil to you. So you do just that. It's what Sarah did. Besides, after being on Mallard and Bunting, there's not much you don't know about narrow boats, is there?"
"I suppose not,"
Izzy said wistfully.
"If you're going to live with Jack in his cottage, will I be able to come over and see you three?"
She meant Jack, Elsie and the baby, but Elsie quickly said 4. Izzy knew she looked confused. Matey, the dog. He's a proper little character. You should get a dog. It would be company for you when you venture off in Jonquil. Do you know how excited I am about the baby? I've got you to thank for my happiness. If you hadn't torn out that advertisement for this job from the newspaper, I'd never have met Jack. Elsie put down a dried saucepan. Again she hugged Izzy. You must feel happy, knowing horrible Charlie can never find you. That's true, Izzy said. You won't think I'm silly if I tell you what I've been thinking about doing after I finish the second trip with Dorothy? Of course not. Why ever would I think that of you? I found lots of unfinished work on Jonquil. There's all kinds of stuff. Tapestry, ready-cut material, sacking for the backs of rugs, pins and needles, embroidery silks and iron-on patterns. It's all put away in cupboards and drawers. It seems Steve-o had had the boat cleared of her personal effects, but left her work materials. I liked having a go at finishing the rug Steve-o gave me, and I'd have finished it by now if I had the time. When he told me that Sarah used to go from village to village on the cut selling her wares, I wondered if I might have a go at that myself. She paused, and before Elsie could answer said, I don't know about getting a dog. It might be nice to have a cat, though. That's a brilliant idea. All of it's a brilliant idea. Is that why you said you might see more of me when I live with Jack? Izzy blushed. You probably think I'm being silly. I can understand why you love Jack and want a family, but it's not for me. I want to explore, see a bit of England's countryside, and if I can earn my living at the same time, all well and good. I'm sure you'll make a success of whatever you do. Elsie hung the wet tea towels to dry over the wooden clothes horse propped near the stove. I only wish I could talk a bit of sense into Tolly. She's asked me if I'd walk back with her to Braunston tonight. Don't look like that. I know it's a fair distance. That girl, Izzy sighed. She's like a dog with a bone when she gets an idea in her head. I suppose she wants to run after Sonny. She wants to go to the do they're having to celebrate Steve-o's life in the Green Man. But we're not invited. We're not gypsies. I tried to tell her that, but she thinks everything's changed now that Sonny has control of all those boats. She's heard he might marry, and I'm scared she'll do something silly, like... Elsie fizzled out. Offer herself up on a plate? Exactly. There was silence in the cabin. She must know the water gypsies only wed their own, said Elsie eventually. If you try telling her that, she won't listen. Apparently, if they marry outside the clan, it can bring all sorts of trouble. Are you going to walk back to Braunston with her? Am I, heck? Said Elsie. I'm pregnant, not stupid. Does Dorothy know about this? Elsie shook her head. No, but if she did, she'd worry. She smiled. But I have thought of a way we might be able to stop Tolly getting hurt. How? It involves Tommy. Tommy? Yes. Haven't you noticed the way they're always bickering, him and Tolly? What's that got to do with it? I've seen the way he stares at her. In all the best romantic novels, the hero and heroine are always the last to know they're in love because of all their arguing. I think that baby sent you doolally, said Izzy. If you say so, but at least help me keep Tolly safe, which she won't be after she's thrown herself at Sonny and he's drunk himself silly with grief and doesn't care who he sleeps with. If you can get off the boat and go back to Braunston before she arrives there, this plan could work. Izzy stared at her. It had better be a damn good plan, then. Chapter 29. I don't know why I let Elsie talk me into this, grumbled Izzy. She was running along the towpath. Dorothy seldom moored up until the last vestiges of light had gone from the day, and kept strictly to blackout regulations. Izzy nearly stumbled in the darkness, but managed to right herself. She swore as she rubbed at her twisted knee. She'd left Elsie to explain her disappearance to Dorothy, and guessed Tolly would take a while dolling herself up to look good for Sonny. Tolly had begged Elsie to let her borrow the print skirt she'd brought with her that had lain unworn in her holdall. It fitted her as if it had been made for her. Eating simply but well, the hard work and fresh air had transformed Tolly. No longer plump and awkward, her hair was glossy, her cheeks pink. Izzy hated the dark. She could almost see well enough to keep to the towpath, and had brought a small torch, but hoped to conserve its failing battery. Her biggest fear was that she'd be unable to find Tommy in Braunston. She'd seen how he looked at Tolly. Elsie was right. If there was one person who could help them stop the girl making a complete fool of herself, it was him. Again, Izzy stumbled. She had to stop to catch her breath. She wasn't sure if she was actually still going in the right direction, but decided that the towpath, though overgrown in places, should eventually take her back to the village. Her mind drifted to Jonquil, her boat. She felt a surge of excitement. She need never go back to Gosport at all now, except to visit her mother. On Jonquil she would be safe, thanks to Steve-O. Dorothy had asked her if she would prefer to spend their well-deserved break living on her own craft, but Izzy was grieving for Steve-O, and had already said, if Dorothy didn't mind, she'd sooner be with her than on her own, wallowing in sadness. Was Dorothy trying to discourage her from visiting Southampton? She had the feeling Dorothy regretted inviting her to her home. No, that wasn't possible, she thought. It had been Dorothy's idea. Izzy had a stitch from running, and she was sweaty with the exertion. Again she stopped to catch her breath. The clean, sweet night air was tainted with wood smoke. She couldn't be far from Braunston, surely. She breathed a sigh of relief that, even if Tolly was now on the towpath, she was behind her, giving Izzy more precious time to find Tommy. But where to look? The towpath merged into the square. The Green Man was busy, music flowing from its darkened windows and door. She wished she'd brought a scarf to cover her bright hair. Izzy waited impatiently for someone to come out of the large main door. She didn't think she would be welcome if she walked straight in. She knew she wouldn't have long to wait, as people were going in and out all the time. A man now stood in the doorway, his hand ready to push open the door. Izzy, not wanting anyone to recognise her, swiftly crept inside after him and positioned herself in a darkened corner, her eyes searching through the cigarette smoke for Tommy. Satisfied he wasn't there, she left and walked back towards the cut and began looking for Aurora. She discovered the boat had been moved from the deserted arm and moored nearby. Aurora and Avalon were in darkness. She listened carefully at the window, but was satisfied no one was on board. She wondered where they had taken Steve-O's body. It was then she heard fiddle music coming from a large nearby barn. When she reached the wooden building, she had to stand on tiptoe to look through the only window that showed a tiny chink of the light that illuminated the inside. The blackout curtain hadn't been pulled across properly. She saw Tommy lifting wooden benches from the back of the hall and setting them out in rows facing a stage. This was probably where the service or get-together would be held, she reasoned. She could see no sign of Sonny. But how to get Tommy's attention? The barn was filled with men setting up tables and arranging vases of flowers. On the stage, 4 musicians were tinkling out tunes with fiddles and tambourines, practising for the next day's spectacle to honour Steve-O, thought Izzy. Luck was on her side as Tommy came close to the window. She tapped sharply on the glass. Tommy's brow furrowed and he looked about him. Izzy tapped again. He came towards the window, then pulled back the curtain and peered out. The moment he saw it was her, he dropped the blackout curtain back into place. Would he come out to see what she wanted or ignore her? After all, she wasn't supposed to be there. No, she thought, Tommy would wonder why she was outside. Izzy stood waiting in the shadows. It wasn't long before Tommy was at her side. She stepped forward to greet him, but he pushed her gently back into the darkness.
This is a gypsy do. You shouldn't be here. I know that. Why do you think I'm hiding? Though what anyone would do to me, I can't imagine.
Izzy said. It's a mark of respect that only Steve-O's people see him off. What do you want? His first words had been brusque, but now his manner had softened.
It's Tolly. She's got a bee in her bonnet that, if she comes here tonight, she can persuade Sonny she's the one for him.
She knew she should be more precise, but surely Tommy would know what she meant. It will spoil Steve-O's do. He petered out as he grasped her meaning.
I want you to convince her to come back to the boats,
Izzy said. He looked cross. And how am I supposed to do that?
Tell her you care about her.
He made a choking sound. Why? I never...
No, that's the trouble. You've never said anything, only mooned after with those big brown eyes of yours. What with Elsie finding Jack and that damn criminal Charlie on my tail, I'm positive she thinks she's still the fat girl no one wants.
But she's beautiful. She wouldn't. Would she? His mouth was now hanging open at the possibility.
Yes, she would. She thinks she needs to prove she can entice a man. And not just any man, Sonny.
You mean she'd sleep with him? His eyes opened wide. Izzy snapped.
If she offers herself, he'll take her, won't he?
Last time I saw him, he was drunk in the pub. But that wouldn't stop him. Most blokes, when they've had a few, can hardly raise a glass. But Sonny... He'd bed any woman to add another notch to his belt.
Tolly seems to equate making love with real love. You've got to stop her before she ruins herself.
What's given her this daft idea?
She heard him and some girl in the bushes the other night when we stopped at the Lock Inn, back along the cut. Why do you think she made him that apple pie? She's desperate for his attention.
Tommy was gazing deeply into her eyes. Izzy could see he was disturbed by what she'd said. And you think she'll take notice of me?
Yes, because you really care about her.
Does it show that much? Izzy put her arms around his thin body.
Only to people like me, who've not seen a lot of real love. Please help her before she does something she'll regret.
So, instead of biding my time, you're asking me to show her my feelings and get my hopes shattered?
If you really care about Tolly, you'll stop her making a fool of herself. She hasn't had the experience to see that she could really be hurt by Sonny, left high and dry.
But it doesn't matter if I get hurt.
If you really care about her, you'll risk that.
There were more furrows in his forehead. I'll have to let them know I'm going off for a while. He jerked a thumb towards the window. They'll understand. Probably think I need a bit of time on my own, he said. Then he sighed. You go back to the boat. Get off the towpath if you see or hear her coming. She mustn't know you've been talking to me.
You'll do it then?
Of course, he said. Chapter 30. She's coming! Tommy practically pushed Izzy through an open gate, then strode towards the tiny wavering light that was coming ever closer along the towpath. He began jogging towards the dull glow, which was barely bright enough to show Tolly the way. "Whatever are you doing here?" Tolly cried. "You scared me half out of my wits." "I've walked up from the village specially to see you," Tommy began. That, at least, was not a lie. "How did you know where we'd moor for the night?" She stood defiantly in front of him. He could smell a light perfume, and his heart ached, because he knew she'd not put it on for him. "Come on, Tolly. I know these cuts, and they're likely overnight mooring places." "I can't stop and talk, Tommy. I'm on my way back to Braunston." He deliberately stood in front of her, barring her way. If it made her angry, then so be it. "Why? To see Sonny?" He could feel his resolve weakening. "Of course." Suddenly he felt deflated. Whatever had possessed him to think he stood a chance with this beautiful woman whose head had been turned by Sonny? "So, you're going to cause a rumpus tonight, of all nights? You're going to butt in where you're not wanted? Show up Sonny and spoil the gypsy send-off for Steve-O? How could you even think of doing that, Tolly?" "Maybe he'll be glad I came to see him. I only want to comfort him." Tommy knew what she meant. Didn't he feel the same for her? But what chance did a scrawny bloke like him have against Sonny, with his glistening curls, his brawny body, and his way of dressing that was the envy of every man on the cut? Sonny was who he was, the legitimate heir to almost all Steve-O had possessed. And what was Tommy? Who was Tommy? You'll be a laughing-stock. The moon had pushed her way out from behind the clouds. He saw the sudden fear in Tolly's eyes, and he knew her, like he knew himself. How can you say that? Because I know him. I know Sonny's ways. If he stood any chance of making her change her mind, it was now or never. Look, let's sit here and talk for a few minutes. He struggled out of his jacket and laid it on the grass. Sit, he commanded. Tommy heard a crack, a twig breaking, perhaps. What's that? Is someone else around? Tolly exclaimed, whirling around to look. Tommy shook his head, dropped down, then pulled her onto his coat beside him. Who's going to be out here? He's just an animal. If Izzy had made the noise, he hoped she was on her way back to the boats now. He felt Tolly shiver. He noticed she was wearing a skirt. He'd never before seen her dressed in anything other than the usual attire of scruffy trousers and thick jumpers to keep out the chills. Pain again bit into his heart that she'd smartened up for Sonny, not him. I've got a story to tell you, he said. He felt her bristle with impatience as she sat close. Get on with it, she said. All right, he said. My mum and dad died of influenza in 1930. A neighbour took me in. I was living in Birmingham then. But although Marie was kind to me, her husband drank. And when he came home, well into his cups, he'd knock us about. 'Cause I was the cuckoo in the nest, I got the brunt of it. We never had much to eat. So, you weren't born to the canals? He shook his head. No, but I might as well have been. One day, Eric broke me arm after hitting me about the head with a lump of wood. I ran down to the cut, scared out of my wits he'd do something worse. There was a couple of black boats waiting to go into the lock, and I hid on one. We was way out in the countryside before I was discovered asleep in a cupboard. My arm was swollen up something terrible, and the pain had knocked me out, you see. Steve-O put my arm in a splint and made me eat. Tommy pushed back his long, curly fringe and showed Tolly a scar. I was only a little un, but when I told Steve-O I came to be hiding on his boat, he let me stay. I knew Marie cared, but what could she do? She had her own children to worry about. Sonny and I became good pals. He was older than me and showed me how to look after a narrowboat. I thought Sarah was the loveliest woman I'd ever seen. He paused. Even then, she used to go off on her own, but she always came back. He glanced at Tolly. She was listening avidly. I was never as good-looking or strong as Sonny, but Steve-O treated me like I belonged, like I was another grandson. When I was 12, I stopped off in Birmingham to see if I could find Marie. I always felt guilty about never letting on to her that I was all right. When I found the family, they were in a right state. The eldest girl, Marlene, was on the game. He saw Tolly frown. Selling herself for money. He saw Tolly nod and felt her hand creep into his. It gave him the courage to carry on. The husband had been hanged for killing Marie in a drunken temper one night. Marlene said she'd look after the two little uns sooner than them go into the workhouse. She got a job in the factory, but because she was only a young un herself, he didn't pay much. She went out at night near the docks to make more money. She didn't tell anyone she was pregnant, but it had begun to show. Although I was skinny, I was strong, still am. He flexed his muscles. I only knew the boats, so I got work humping stuff, shovelling coal at the wharf. Course, no one believed I was strong enough until I showed them I was. Marlene lost the baby. She was like a sister to me. I stayed because they and Steve-O were all the family I'd ever known. She met a bloke who took her on with the two little uns, and they went to live just outside Birmingham. They're still together, and she's got a little boy of her own now. She's who I was going to see when I catched a trip on Aurora.
Was? Going to see?
It was a shock for me to find out Steve-O was so ill. Somehow I thought he'd always be there, you know. I'll be back and forth, working the cut with Steve-O and Sonny for a long time. Now I've discovered he's left me something.
A boat?
He had her full attention now. She shivered, so he pulled her closer. Nah, Sonny gets all the business. He'll look after it. Steve-O knew that. Tolly looked crestfallen.
Dorothy told me Sonny can't read. I could teach him.
Bless you. He wouldn't thank you for suggesting that. Sonny's the sharpest thing on 2 legs on the cut. What does he need with letters?
Well, I know you can read. I've seen you reading.
Yeah, well, I'm one of the lucky ones. But I got a proposition for you, Tolly. She stared at him. His heart was turning somersaults. Here it was, the time to ask her. I know you got your heart set on a cafe back in Titchfield. I got a fair amount that Steve-O's left me. See, it isn't only Izzy who's come into some good fortune.
But what's that got to do with me?
He took a deep breath. I'll buy the cafe, and you run it. He could almost see the cogs turning in her brain as she gasped. She knew, without him saying another word, that the price she had to pay was to go back to Mallard and Bunting and forget about Sonny. He closed his eyes. He'd said his bit. He hadn't told her he loved her, but how could she fail to see he cared? He wanted her answer, but he didn't want her to refuse or feel rushed. Izzy was astute enough to realise he cared for Tolly, had asked for his help, but she could never have envisaged he would come up with this offer to save Tolly from herself. After a long while, when all he could hear was animals in the undergrowth and water lapping on the cut, he ventured, Well, what'd you say? I know you think Sonny will give you excitement. I won't. I can't. You are a fantastic cook, and I believe you can make a success of the currant bun. But I'll stay in the background or help, as you wish, and maybe, just maybe, someday, you'll have feelings for me. Because I really care about you.
You'd do this for me.
In the moonlight, he saw her eyes were moist with unshed tears. Steve-O knew I never had money before, except the pittances I work for. I don't want money for myself, but I do love you. And if I can help to make your dream come true, well... He was shaking. He'd finally told her of his love. Tolly leaned her head on his shoulder.
I've never had any man care about me that much to want to do something so wonderful, she said. But you can't just hand over money without wanting something in return.
So she was considering his offer. I'll stay in the background, a sort of sleeping partner, I think it's called.
Oh, no, she cried. That wouldn't be right. No, not at all. If you really are serious about this, Tommy, I could throw my arms around your neck and kiss you to death.
He didn't tell her that was exactly what he'd love her to do, but he listened as she carried on.
Come back to the Bunting with me. Let me show you the plans I have for the cafe. The war isn't going to last forever, is it? Soon I'll be going home to Titchfield for a few days. Why don't you come with me? You could see the cafe, meet my dad and my sister.
He felt happier than he'd ever been. Yes, he'd take her back to Bunting, make sure she boarded the boat, but he didn't fancy getting shouted at for waking the other girls. Dorothy could be a tartar when she was roused. Besides, if they weren't going to a pub, they often went to bed as soon as it got dark. He'd soon catch up with Tolly after Steve-O had been laid to rest. They could talk and plan then to their heart's content. Tolly was practically hanging off his neck. He twisted around and tenderly, his heart thumping wildly, allowed his lips to graze her forehead. Then he whispered, "Come on, Tolly, my love. Let's get you back to the boat." Chapter 31. Elsie was reading when she heard the low hum of voices outside. The candle flickered. Dorothy was still asleep. The top of her head showed above her sleeping bag, her long hair snaking down on the blankets. She looked younger when her hair wasn't pulled back in that tight bun, Elsie thought. The voices quietened, and she heard footsteps on the stones of the towpath. There were no loud noises, no crying. She gave a sigh of relief. At the soft but heavy tread of rubber-soled shoes on wood, Mallard swayed as someone tripped across the deck to the craft tied next to it. She guessed Tolly was returning to Bunting. She hadn't heard Izzy come back, but had there been trouble, she would surely have known about it by now. Izzy moved quietly, like a cat. She blew out the candle, satisfied that now she would be able to sleep. Elsie put her book on the floor. As she moved, a crackle of paper reminded her of the 2 letters she'd been reading earlier. She'd collected them from the post office at Braunston, and marvelled that Jack seemed to guess exactly where and when the boats would arrive, so she could pick up her letters from him. She smiled in the dark. She'd never received love letters from Geoffrey, but then she'd never believed in love at first sight until it had happened to her. Jack's declarations meant so much to her. She put her hand across her abdomen. Sometimes she felt so happy it seemed incredible. The other letter had been sent on from Lower Hayford. Geoffrey wanted to arrange a meeting, time and place entirely up to her. He said he didn't expect her to come home. He would travel to wherever she wanted. Her first thought had been to write back and tell him she had no intention of meeting him. But what if he had a buyer for the house? The money she was owed needed to be addressed. Plus, she no longer wanted to keep her and Jack's relationship a secret. A meeting seemed a small price to pay to have everything out in the open. Elsie yawned. Time to sleep. Dorothy had muttered something about wanting to arrive in Warwick tomorrow. Contentedly, she closed her eyes. End of CD 6.